Section 1 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. The Other Gods by H.P. Lovecraft. Atop the tallest of Earth's peak dwell the gods of Earth, and suffer no man to tell that he hath looked upon them. Lesser peaks they once inhabited, but ever the men from the plains would scale the slopes of rock and snow, driving the gods to higher and higher mountains, till now only the last remains. When they left their older peaks, they took with them all signs of themselves, save once, it is said, when they left a carven image on the face of the mountain which they called Grandin. But now they have betaken themselves to unknown Kadath and the cold waste, where no man treads, and are grown stern, having no higher peak whereto to flee at the coming of men. They are grown stern, and where once they suffered men to displace them, they now forbid men to come, or coming to depart. It is well for men that they know not of Kadath and the cold waste, else they would seek injudiciously to scale it. Sometimes when Earth's gods are homesick, they visit in the still night the peaks where once they dwelt, and weep softly as they try to play in the olden way on remembered slopes. Men have felt the tears of the gods on white-capped Thorai, though they have thought it rain, and have heard the sighs of the gods in the plaintive dawn winds of Lirion. In cloud ships the gods are wont to travel, and wise cotters have legends that keep them from certain high peaks at night, when it is cloudy, for the gods are not lenient as of old. In Ulthar, which lies beyond the river Sky, once dwelt an old man avid to behold the gods of Earth, a man deeply learned in the 7 cryptical books of Earth, and familiar with the narcotic manuscripts of distant and frozen Lomar. His name was Barzai the Wise, and the villagers tell of how he went up a mountain on the night of the strange eclipse. Barzai knew so much of the gods that he could tell of their comings and goings, and guessed so many of their secrets that he was deemed half a god himself. It was he who wisely advised the burgesses of Ulthar when they passed their remarkable law against the slaying of cats, and who first told the young priest Atal where it is that black cats go at midnight on St. John's Eve. Barzai was learned in the lore of Earth's gods, and had gained a desire to look upon their faces. He believed that his great knowledge of gods could shield him from their wrath, so resolved to go up to the summit of high and rocky Hatheg Kla on a night when he knew the gods would be there. Hatheg Kla is far in the stony desert beyond Hatheg, for which it is named, and rises like a rock statue in a silent temple. Around its peak the mists play always mournfully, for mists are the memories of the gods, and the gods loved Hatheg Kla when they dwelt upon it in the old days. Often the gods of Earth visit Hatheg Kla in their ships of cloud, casting pale vapors over the slopes as they dance reminiscently on the summit under a clear moon. The villagers of Hatheg say it is ill to climb Hatheg Kla at any time, and deadly to climb it by night when pale vapors hide the summit and the moon. But Barzai heeded them not when he came from neighboring Ulthar with the young priest Atal, who was his disciple. Atal was only the son of an innkeeper, and was sometimes afraid, but Barzai's father had been a landgrave who dwelt in an ancient castle, so he had no common superstition in his blood, and only laughed at the fearful cotters. Barzai and Atal went out of Hatheg into the stony desert despite the prayers of peasants, and talked of Earth's gods by their campfires at night. Many days they traveled, and from afar saw lofty Hatheg Kla with his aureole of mournful mist. On the 13th day they reached the mountain's lonely base, and Atal spoke of his fears. But Barzai was old and learned and had no fears, so led the way boldly up the slope that no man had scaled since the time of Sansu, who is written of with fright in the moldy, narcotic manuscripts. The way was rocky and made perilous by chasms, cliffs, and falling stones. Later it grew cold and snowy, and Barzai and Atal often slipped and fell as they hewed and plodded upward with staves and axes. Finally the air grew thin, and the sky changed color, and the climbers found it hard to breathe. But still they toiled up and up, marveling at the strangeness of the scene, and thrilling at the thought of what would happen on the summit when the moon was out, and the pale vapors spread around, For 3 days they climbed higher and higher toward the roof of the world. Then they camped to wait for the clouding of the moon. For 4 nights no clouds came, and the moon shone down cold through the thin, mournful mists around the silent pinnacle. Then on the 5th night, which was the night of the full moon, Barzai saw some dense clouds far to the north, and stayed up with Atal to watch them draw near. Thick and majestic they sailed, slowly and deliberately onward, ranging themselves round the peak high above the watchers, and hiding the moon and the summit from view. For a long hour the watchers gazed, whilst the vapors swirled, and the screen of clouds grew thicker and more restless. Barzai was wise in the lore of Earth's gods, and listened hard for certain sounds, but Atal felt the chill of the vapors, and the awe of the night, and feared much. And when Barzai began to climb higher and beckon eagerly, it was long before Atal would follow. So thick were the vapors that the way was hard, and though Atal followed on at last, he could scarcely see the grey shape of Barzai on the dim slope above in the clouded moonlight. Barzai forged very far ahead, and seemed, despite his age, to climb more easily than Atal, fearing not the steepness that began to grow too great for any save a strong and dauntless man, nor pausing at wide black chasms that Atal could scarcely leap. And so they went up wildly over rocks and gulfs, slipping and stumbling, and sometimes awed at the vastness and horrible silence of bleak ice pinnacles and mute granite steeps. Very suddenly Barzai went out of Atal's sight, scaling a hideous cliff that seemed to bulge outward and block the path for any climber not inspired of Earth's gods. Atal was far below, and planning what he should do when he reached the place, when curiously he noticed that the light had grown strong, as if the cloudless peak and moonlit meeting place of the gods were very near. And as he scrambled on toward the bulging cliff and litten sky, he felt fears more shocking than any he had known before. Then, through the high mists, he heard the voice of unseen Barzai, shouting wildly in delight. "I have heard the gods! I have heard Earth's gods singing in revelry on Hotheg Kla! The voices of Earth's gods are known to Barzai the prophet. The mists are thin, and the moon is bright, and I shall see the gods dancing wildly on Hotheg Kla that they loved in youth. The wisdom of Barzai hath made him greater than Earth's gods, and against his will their spells and barriers are as naught. Barzai will behold the gods, the proud gods, the secret gods, the gods of Earth who spurn the sight of man." Atal could not hear the voices Barzai heard, but he was now close to the bulging cliff and scanning it for footholds. Then he heard Barzai's voice grow shriller and louder. "The mist is very thin, and the moon casts shadows on the slope. The voice of Earth's gods art high and wild, and they fear the coming of Barzai the Wise, who is greater than they. The moon's light flickers as Earth's gods dance against it. I shall see the dancing forms of the gods that leap and howl in the moonlight. The light is dimmer, and the gods are afraid." While Barzai was shouting these things, Atal felt a spectral change in all the air, as if the laws of Earth were bowing to greater laws. For though the way was steeper than ever, the upward path was now grown fearsomely easy, and the bulging cliff proved scarce an obstacle when he reached it and slid perilously up its convex face. The light of the moon had strangely failed, and as Atal plunged upward through the mists, he heard Barzai the Wise shrieking in the shadows, "The moon is dark, and the gods dance in the night. There is terror in the sky, for upon the moon hath sunk an eclipse foretold in no books of men or of Earth's gods. There is unknown magic on Hotheg Kla, for the screams of the frightened gods have turned to laughter, and the slopes of ice shoot up endlessly into the black heavens whither I am plunging. High, high, at last, in the dim light, I behold the gods of Earth." And now Atal, slipping dizzily up over inconceivable steeps, heard in the dark a loathsome laughing, mixed with such a cry as no man else ever heard save in the Phlegethon of unrelatable nightmares. A cry wherein reverberated the horror and anguish of a haunted lifetime, packed into one atrocious moment. "They are the gods! The gods of the outer hells that guard the feeble gods of Earth! Look away! Go back! Do not see! Do not see! The vengeance of the infinite abysses! That cursed, that damnable pit! Merciful gods of Earth, I am falling into the sky!" And as Atal shut his eyes, and stopped his ears, and tried to jump downward against the frightful pull from unknown heights, there resounded on Hotheg Kla that terrible peal of thunder which awakened the good cotters of the plains and the honest burgesses of Hatheg, Nir, and Ulthar, and caused them to behold through the clouds that strange eclipse of the moon that no book ever predicted. And when the moon came out at last, Atal was safe on the lower snows of the mountain without sight of Earth's gods, or of the other gods. Now it is told in the moldy Nakatic manuscripts that Sansu found naught but wordless ice and rock when he did climb Hatheg Claw in the youth of the world. Yet when the men of Ulthar and Nir and Hatheg crushed their fears and scaled that haunted steep by day in search of Barzai the Wise, they found graven in the naked stone of the summit a curious and cyclopean symbol 50 cubits wide, as if the rock had been riven by some titanic chisel. And the symbol was like to one that learned men have discerned in those frightful parts of the Nakatic manuscripts which were too ancient to be read. This they found. Barzai the Wise they never found, nor could the holy priest Atal ever be persuaded to pray for his soul's repose. Moreover, to this day the people of Ulthar and Nir and Hatheg fear eclipses, and pray by night when pale vapors hide the mountain top and the moon. And above the mists on Hatheg Claw, Earth's gods sometimes dance reminiscently, for they know they are safe, and love to come from unknown Kadath in ships of cloud, and play in the olden way, as they did when Earth was new, and men not given to climbing of inaccessible places. End of Section 1. Section 2 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Birkett's 12th Corpse by August Derleth. The wall of hate that stood between the two old rivermen, Fred Birkett and Hank Bloom, had grown from a strange and gruesome rivalry, the finding of dead bodies of persons drowned in the Wisconsin River at Sac Prairie. At the time of the tragic drowning of Bud Enders, the rivermen were tied. Each had found 11 bodies in the past 40 years. It was said by each of them, and repeated in Sac Prairie, that Bud Enders' body would decide the contest. The sympathy of Sac Prairie was with Birkett, a kindly old man in contrast to the sullen surliness of Bloom, who was, too, somewhat younger. Birkett had always joked about his odd luck at finding bodies in the river, and still looked upon his almost uncanny way of knowing where the bodies had been taken by the swift current as more amusing than not. But Blum had brooded upon his rival's luck ever since Birkett had earned a $500 reward for finding the corpse of a young student who had fallen into the Wisconsin while drunk almost a decade before. Now Bloom made no effort to conceal his violent hatred for Birkett, nor could Birkett keep down his dislike for his rival. Bud Enders was drowned on a warm night in July, and 20 boats put out from Sac Prairie within an hour after he went down. Fred Birkett and Hank Bloom were among them. Both the old men headed downstream, knowing by long past experience that the swift current in mid-channel, where the youth was drawn under, would quickly roll the body below Sac Prairie toward the long clay riverbank southeast of the village, locally known as the Yellow Banks District. Toward dawn, Fred Birkett found Bud Enders' body rolling along in shallow but swift water, crossing a sandbar just above the Yellow Banks. The moon was out, and he had no difficulty seeing the body, which he immediately caught with a boat hook and secured to the boat without taking it from the water. Then he edged his boat out of the current and made swiftly upstream. Just where Heine's Slough enters the Wisconsin, he met Bloom. He could not help boasting. "Just made my dozen," he called to Hank in a gruff yet faintly triumphant voice. Bloom turned his boat and swung across the current toward him. Birkett rested on his oars. Unaware of the fury that consumed his rival, he went on. "Well, we couldn't both find him. Let the best man win, I always said," and smiled in the satisfaction of feeling himself the better of the two. Bloom had said nothing, but now he was looking cautiously upstream and down, his eyes scanning the surface of the water for sight of any boat, his ears waiting to catch any sound that might indicate the approach of other searchers. The two boats lay in quiet water away from the current. Whether or not Birkett heard Bloom loosen and jerk out one oar is problematical. He turned toward Bloom just as the oar descended and caught him a glancing blow on the side of the head, toppling him from his boat and turning the boat with him. Then, with a savage lunge, he pushed Birkett's boat out of reach of the older man, just as he came coughing and gasping to the surface of the water. With another quick movement, Bloom detached Enders' body from the overturned boat. He made no attempt to catch the body, knowing that the current would not carry it from this quiet water, and he could always return and find it. Then he shot away, unmindful of Birkett's despairing cries and secure in the knowledge that Birkett could not swim very well. A little way upstream he paused and listened. There was no sound from below. Birkett had gone down. A cunning smile crossed his lips. Edging the boat into shallow water, he let himself fall fully clothed into the river, wetting himself thoroughly except for his torn hat, which he threw into the bottom of the boat to give it the appearance of having been hastily torn away from his head and thrown there. Then he got back into the boat and rowed furiously toward Sac Prairie. The circle of boats was now further downstream, and he did not have to row up quite as far as he drifted down. He timed his entrance well, for the boy's cap had just been found along the shore, and the searchers were excited over their find. Quite suddenly he shot up from under the bridge in the yellow glow of lanterns held high above the water. "Birkett's gone under!" he shouted frantically. "His boat's tipped just above the yellow banks!" Anyone who doubted his cries was easily convinced by his bedraggled appearance, and it did not require his explanation that he had gone into the water after Birkett to explain the wetness of his clothes. He told hastily that the old man fought hard, that he had to hit him finally, and had at last reluctantly to let him go in order to save himself. As he led the rowboats to a spot 100 yards above the entrance to Heine's slough, where in the quiet water the two bodies still lay, Bloom was enjoying the irony of the knowledge that his 12th body would be that of his old rival. He broke into speech again, excitedly telling about the accident, and explaining that the boat had long since gone downstream, swept away by the powerful current in which it had tipped. He pointed out approximately the place where the accident had occurred, and went glibly over his story a third time. Then he left the searchers and pulled into the current toward the dark waters where Birkett had actually gone down. That much Sac Prairie was later able to piece together. What happened after that is more obscure and fraught with horrific suggestion. It is certain that he went downstream, and equally certain that he seemed to be heading for Heine's slough, though one or two disputed this point later. Despite the moon, it was difficult to observe Bloom's progress downstream, for he was soon lost in the very heavy shadows on the quiet water surrounding the slough's junction with the river. In the babble of sound made by the searchers above the slough, Blum might have called for some time and not have been heard, though this is doubtful. At any rate, during a lull in the conversation, someone picked up the sound of frantic calling. Everyone stood and listened. Once again came a sharp call in a voice which was immediately identified as Hank Bloom's. The call was heavy with horror and fear. Then another call began to sound, but was abruptly stopped, almost as if it had been rudely shut off by a hand clapped over the lips through which it came. The boats immediately pulled away toward Heine's slough. At first there was nothing to be seen except the bottoms of two overturned boats, one of which was Bloom's, the other Birkett's. Then someone saw the body of Ender over against one bank, apparently just washing up from deep water. Quite near it, partly submerged, they found the bodies of Hank Bloom and Fred Birkett. Bloom was dead, but he had not been drowned. He had been strangled. For when the horrified searchers pulled him out of the water, they found Fred Birkett's dead fingers sunk deep in the flesh of Bloom's neck. Birkett had found his 12th corpse. End of Section 2. Section 3 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Spurs of Death by Natalie H. Woolley. The warden leaned back in his chair as he watched the door close, then turned to the man who stood looking out of the window. "Well, Jim?" he queried. The other came slowly back to the desk and reseated himself. His face was puzzled. "Who was that, Tom? He seems strangely familiar, and yet I can't seem to place him." "That man was Cliff Williams, the cowboy murderer," said the warden. "You may have seen his picture in the papers. He gets a chair next month for the 3 murders he has committed." Jim Kelton registered surprise. "He doesn't look like the sort of person to do such a thing like that. He seems almost a kid." The warden smiled grimly. "His looks are deceiving. He's killed 3 men in the last 10 years, and as far as anyone knows, without any reason. I'll tell you the story if you care to hear it." The other assented. "Well, the first one was a cowhand down in Texas about 10 years ago. He was working on a ranch down there, and he and this fellow got in an argument over something. He shot him. Then he raked his face open with his spurs. That was the thing that trapped him in the end. Every time he killed, he marked his victim's face. Horrible, I grant you. Well, he disappeared, and finally the case was forgotten. He was a kid of 19 or 20 then. 5 years later he turned up in Oregon. Worked on the Lazy T Ranch there. All the men liked him, too. He was quiet, knew his business, and never talked much. Then one day he came in from the line camp, and the foreman gave him his pay. There seemed to be some mistake in it, and he went to the ranch house to see Danby, the owner. None of the boys noticed him come out, but when the cook went to call him to dinner, he found Danby dead. Choked to death, his face ripped open and the cowboy gone. When they went to look for Williams, he was gone. When next they heard of him, the police got a call to investigate a brawl in a Laredo saloon. When they arrived and broke through the circle, they saw 2 men struggling. Suddenly one fell, and then before they could reach Williams, he lifted his spurred foot and slashed the face of the fallen man. Then they got him. Then the police started for him. They got him after a terrible fight. The other fella died in the hospital shortly after. The warden shook his head. He's a tough one. Never a muscle when they sentenced him. Too bad. Jim Kelton rose and picked up his hat. Well, I guess I'd better run along. Come out for a game of bridge some night, Tom. Ellen was saying the other day that we never see you anymore. The warden opened the door for his friend. I'll be out some night soon, he promised, smiling. As William stood waiting for the trustee to unlock the door of his cell, his eyes met those of Lowry, the man in the next cell. Between the two had grown up an active dislike, the more threatening because unspoken, at least so far. It remained for Claffin across the way to bring the thing out into the open. They were all discussing an expected arrival. Said Claffin, I guess this new bird is plenty tough. He murdered his wife and 2 kids. That's even worse than Cowboy there. Lowry cut in sneeringly. I don't agree with you. He didn't carve him up afterwards like Williams did. Nobody in their right mind could do a thing like that. I couldn't, and neither could any of the rest of you fellas, he charged. No one answered. The others knew of the enmity between the two, and a strained silence filled the place. Then at last Williams spoke, his voice hoarse, fairly quivering with rage. All right, Lowry. You've said plenty. I'll remember it. And don't forget this. You'll be next. You'll be next, he repeated harshly. Lowry laughed, mockingly. The guard coming down the hall put a stop to further conversation for the time being. But now the quarrel between the two was out in the open, and through the following days and weeks Lowry seemed possessed of some imp of perversity, and taunted and jibed at Williams continuously. Much of the time the cowboy murderer lay on his back on the cot and stared sullenly at the ceiling, only turning at times to throw Lowry a venomous glance. At times Lowry grew ashamed for taunting a doomed man, but something inside of him, stronger than he, urged him on implacably. Once in a while he shuddered at the looks given him by the other, and silently he blessed the bars that kept them apart. Then came William's last morning. The prison chaplain came to administer the last rites, but fled before the storm of curses that met him. After his departure, a long silence fell that lasted till they came for him. Even Lowry was silent, and sat soberly watching. As they brought him out, and he passed Lowry, he stopped and looked in. His eyes, filled with immeasurable hatred, met those of Lowry. On his face was a malignant sneer. "Remember you're next," he said slowly, and passed on down the corridor. Lowry watched his retreating form till it passed from sight. Claffin called across in a hoarse whisper, "What do you make of this? Williams asked them to bury him with his spurs on. Funny, isn't it?" Lowry did not answer for the reason that at the word spurs, a queerly premonitory chill passed over him. Uneasily, he recalled the other's parting word and the cold, evil hatred of the other's glance. He tried to shake off the cold, chilly feeling that was settling over him, but without success. There seemed to be an indefinable change in the atmosphere, a sense of something horrible about to happen. They all felt it in a lesser degree. The gray day dragged along and the conversation lagged. By common consent, they all avoided glancing at the empty cell. It seemed too potent a reminder of the thing that waited for them all. Dusk settled down and shadows began to fill the corners. And then Lowry, glancing idly out the door of his cell, gave a startled cry. There in the shadows before his cell door he saw something, a shadow that formed, that seemed to pause and linger before him. Then, as he cried out, it melted into nothing and was gone. His heart was beating fast, pounding with the nameless fear that held him in an ever-tightening grip. The sense of impending calamity drew closer. He began to shake. "What's wrong?" called Claffin curiously, his voice low. Laurie's eyes fastened on the empty cell next to him. Did not answer. He could not. He was watching something. Something that formed before his eyes into a man. A shadowy figure that smiled horribly and wore gleaming spurs. He saw it form, growing clearer and drawing nearer the bars. The shadowy eyes gazed back into his terrified ones, and then he screamed at the thing he read in them. A scream that died in his throat in a gurgle as he fell heavily. The guard came running. "What's going on here?" he demanded angrily. He peered in suspiciously at the fallen figure. At last they entered the silent cell and raised him to his cot. He was dead. And across the horror that death had stamped indelibly on his face, there ran the livid gash of a spur. End of section 3. Section 4 of Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Gods of the North by Robert E. Howard. The clangor of swords had died away. The shouting of the slaughter was hushed. Silence lay on the red-stained snow. The pale bleak sun that glittered so blindingly from the ice fields and the snow-covered plains struck sheens of silver from rent corselet and broken blade, where the dead lay in heaps. The nerveless hand yet gripped the broken hilt. Helmeted heads, back-drawn in the death throes, tilted red beards and golden beards grimly upward, as if in last invocation to Ymir the frost giant. Across the red drifts and mail-clad forms 2 figures approached one another. In that utter desolation only they moved. The frosty sky was over them, the white illimitable plain around them, the dead men at their feet. Slowly through the corpses they came, as ghosts might come to a tryst through the shambles of a world. Their shields were gone, their corselets dented. Blood smeared their mail, their swords were red. Their horned helmets showed the marks of fierce strokes. One spoke, he whose locks and beard were red as the blood on the sunlit snow. "Man of the raven locks," said he, "tell me your name, so that my brothers in Vanaheim may know who was the last of the Wulfir's band to fall before the sword of Heimdall." "This is my answer," replied the black-haired warrior. "Not in Vanaheim, but in Valhalla will you tell your brothers the name of Amra of Akbitana." Heimdall roared and sprang, and his sword swung in a mighty arc. Amra staggered, and his vision was filled with red sparks as the blade shivered into bits of blue fire on his helmet. But as he reeled, he thrust with all the power of his great shoulders. The sharp point drove through brass scales and bones and heart, and the red-haired warrior died at Amra's feet. Amra stood swaying, trailing his sword, a sudden sick weariness assailing him. The glare of the sun on the snow cut his eyes like a knife, and the sky seemed shrunken and strangely far. He turned away from the trampled expanse where yellow-bearded warriors lay locked with red-haired slayers in the embrace of death. A few steps he took, and the glare of the snowfields was suddenly dimmed. A rushing wave of blindness engulfed him, and he sank down into the snow, supporting himself on one mailed arm, seeking to shake the blindness out of his eyes as a lion might shake his mane. A silvery laugh cut through his dizziness, and his sight cleared slowly. There was a strangeness about all the landscape that he could not place or define, an unfamiliar tinge to earth and sky. But he did not think long of this. Before him, swaying like a sapling in the wind, stood a woman. Her body was like ivory, and save for a veil of gossamer, she was naked as the day. Her slender bare feet were whiter than the snow they spurned. She laughed, and her laughter was sweeter than the rippling of silvery fountains, and poisonous with cruel mockery. "Who are you?" demanded the warrior. "What matter?" Her voice was more musical than a silver-stringed harp, but it was edged with cruelty. "Call up your men!" he growled, grasping his sword. "Though my strength fail me, yet they shall not take me alive. I see that you are of the Vanir." "Have I said so?" He looked again at her unruly locks, which he had thought to be red. Now he saw they were neither red nor yellow, but a glorious compound of both colors. He gazed spellbound. Her hair was like elfin gold, striking which the sun dazzled him. Her eyes were neither wholly blue nor wholly gray, but of shifting colors and dancing lights and clouds of colors he could not recognize. Her full red lips smiled, and from her slim feet to the blinding crown of her billowy hair, her ivory body was as perfect as the dream of a god. Amra's pulse hammered in his temples. "I cannot tell," said he, "whether you are of Vanaheim and mine enemy, or of Asgard and my friend. Far have I wandered, from Zingara to the sea of Viliet, and Stygia, and Cush, and the country of Hyrcanians, but a woman like you I have never seen. Your locks blind me with their brightness. Not even among the fairest daughters of the Aesir have I seen such hair. By Ymir!"
"Who are you to swear by Ymir?" she mocked. "Who know you of the gods of ice and snow, you who have come up from the south to adventure among strangers?"
"By the dark gods of my own race," he cried in anger. "Have I been backward in the sword play, stranger or no? This day I have seen 80 warriors fall, and I alone survived the field where Wulfhere's reavers met the men of Bragi. Tell me, woman, have you caught the flash of mail across the snow plains, or seen armed men moving upon the ice?"
"I have seen the hoarfrost glittering in the sun," she answered. "I have heard the wind whispering across the everlasting snows."
He shook his head. "Nord should have come up with us before the battle joined. I fear he and his warriors have been ambushed. Wulfhere lies dead with all his weapon men. I thought there was no village within many leagues of this spot, for the war carried us far. But you can have come no great distance over these snows, naked as you are. Lead me to your tribe, if you are of Asgard, for I am faint with the weariness of strife."
"My dwelling place is further than you can walk, Amra of Akhibatana."
Spreading wide her arms, she swayed before him, her golden head lolling wantonly, her scintillant eyes shadowed beneath long silken lashes.
"Am I not beautiful, man?"
"Like dawn running naked on the snows," he muttered, his eyes burning like those of a wolf.
"Then why do you not rise and follow me? Who is the strong warrior who falls down before me?" she chanted in maddening mockery. "Lie down and die in the snow with the other fools, Amra of the black hair. You cannot follow where I would lead."
With an oath, the man heaved himself upon his feet, his blue eyes blazing, his dark scarred face convulsed. Rage shook his soul, but desire for the taunting figure before him hammered at his temples and drove his wild blood riotously through his veins. Passion fierce as physical agony flooded his whole being, so that earth and sky swam red to his dizzy gaze, and weariness and faintness were swept from him in madness. He spoke no word as he drove at her, fingers hooked like talons. With a shriek of laughter, she leaped back and ran, laughing at him over her white shoulder. With a low growl, Amra followed. He had forgotten the fight, forgotten the mailed warriors who lay in their blood, forgotten Njord's belated reavers. He had thought only for the slender white shape which seemed to float rather than run before him. Out across the white blinding plain she led him. The trampled red field fell out of sight behind him, but still Amra kept on with the silent tenacity of his race. His mailed feet broke through the frozen crust. He sank deep in the drifts and forged through them by sheer strength. But the girl danced across the snow as light as a feather floating across a pool. Her naked feet scarcely left their imprint on the hoarfrost. In spite of the fire in his veins, the cold bit through the warrior's mail and furs. But the girl in her gossamer veil ran as lightly and as gaily as if she danced through the palms and rose gardens of Poitain. Black curses drooled through the warrior's parched lips. The great veins swelled and throbbed in his temples, and his teeth gnashed spasmodically. "You cannot escape me!" he roared. "Lead me into a trap, and I'll pile the heads of your kinsmen at your feet. Hide from me, and I'll tear apart the mountains to find you. I'll follow you to hell and beyond hell." Her maddening laughter floated back to him, and foam flew from the warrior's lips. Further and further into the wastes she led him, till he saw the wide plains give way to low hills, marching upward in broken ranges. Far to the north he caught a glimpse of towering mountains, blue with the distance or white with the eternal snows. Above these mountains shone the flaring rays of the Borealis. They spread fanwise into the sky, frosty blades of cold flaming light changing in color, growing and brightening. Above him the skies glowed and crackled with strange lights and gleams. The snow shone weirdly, now frosty blue, now icy crimson, now cold silver. Through a shimmering, icy realm of enchantment, Amra plunged doggedly onward, in a crystalline maze where the only reality was the white body dancing across the glittering snow beyond his reach. Ever beyond his reach. Yet he did not wonder at the necromantic strangeness of it all, not even when two gigantic figures rose up to bar his way. The scales of their mail were white with hoarfrost, their helmets and their axes were sheathed in ice. Snow sprinkled their locks, and their beards were spikes of icicles. Their eyes were cold as the lights that streamed above them.
"Brothers," cried the girl, dancing between them, "look who follows. I have brought you a man for the feasting. Take his heart, that we may lay it smoking on our father's board."
The giants answered with roars like the grinding of icebergs on a frozen shore, and heaved up their shining axes as the maddened Akbatanan hurled himself upon them. A frosty blade flashed before his eyes, blinding him with its brightness, and he gave back a terrible stroke that sheared through his foe's thigh. With a groan the victim fell, and at the instant Amra was dashed into the snow, his left shoulder numb from the blow of the survivor, from which the warrior's mail had barely saved his life. Amra saw the remaining giant looming above him like a colossus of carved ice, etched against the glowing sky. The axe fell, to sink through the snow and deep into the frozen earth, as Amra hurled himself aside and leaped to his feet. The giant roared and wrenched the axe head free, but even as he did so, Amra's sword sank down. The giant's knees bent, and he sank slowly into the snow, which turned crimson with the blood that gushed from his half-severed neck. Amra wheeled to see the girl standing a short distance away, staring in wide-eyed horror, all mockery gone from her face. He cried out fiercely, and the blood drops flew from his sword as his hand shook in the intensity of his passion.
"Call the rest of your brothers," he roared. "Call the dogs. I'll give their hearts to the wolves."
With a cry of fright, she turned and fled. She did not laugh now, nor mock him over her shoulder. She ran as for her life, and though he strained every nerve in Thew until his temples were like to burst, and the snow swam red to his gaze, she drew away from him, dwindling in the witch-fire of the skies, until she was a figure no bigger than a child, then a dancing white flame on the snow, then a dim blur in the distance. But grinding his teeth until the blood started from his gums, he reeled on, and he saw the blur grow to a dancing white flame, and the flame to a figure big as a child, and then she was running less than 100 paces ahead of him, and slowly the space narrowed foot by foot. She was running with effort now, her golden locks blowing free. He heard the quick panting of her breath, and saw a flash of fear in the look she cast over her alabaster shoulder. The grim endurance of the warrior had served him well. The speed ebbed from her flashing white legs. She reeled in her gait, and his untamed soul flamed up the fires of hell she had fanned so well. With an inhuman roar, he closed in on her, just as she wheeled with a haunting cry and flung out her arms to fend him off. His sword fell into the snow as he crushed her to him. Her supple body bent backward as she fought with desperate frenzy in his iron arms. Her golden hair blew about his face, blinding him with its sheen. The feel of her slender figure twisting in his mailed arms drove him to blinder madness. His strong fingers sank deep into her smooth flesh, and that flesh was cold as ice. It was as if he embraced not a woman of human flesh and blood, but a woman of flaming ice. She writhed her golden head aside, striving to avoid the savage kisses that bruised her red lips.
"You are cold as the snows,"
he mumbled dazedly.
"I will warm you with the fire in my own blood."
With a desperate wrench, she twisted from his arms, leaving her single gossamer garment in his grasp. She sprang back and faced him, her golden locks in wild disarray, her white bosom heaving, her beautiful eyes blazing with terror. For an instant he stood frozen, awed by her terrible beauty as she posed naked against the snows. And in that instant she flung her arms toward the lights that glowed in the skies above her, and cried out in a voice that rang in Amra's ears forever after,
"Ymir, oh my father, save me!"
Amra was leaping forward, arms spread to seize her, when with a cackle like the breaking of an ice mountain, the whole skies leaped into icy fire. The girl's ivory body was suddenly enveloped in a cold blue flame so blinding that the warrior threw up his hands to shield his eyes. A fleeting instant. Skies and snowy hills were bathed in crackling white flames, blue darts of icy light, and frozen crimson fires. Then Amra staggered and cried out. The girl was gone. The glowing snow lay empty and bare. High above him, the witch lights flashed and played in a frosty sky gone mad, and among the distant blue mountains there sounded a rolling thunder, as of a gigantic war chariot rushing behind steeds whose frantic hoofs struck lightning from the snows and echoes from the skies. Then, suddenly the Borealis, the snowy hills and the blazing heavens reeled drunkenly to Amra's sight. Thousands of fireballs burst with showers of sparks, and the sky itself became a titanic wheel which rained stars as it spun. Under his feet the snowy hills heaved up like a wave, and the Akbatanen crumpled into the snows to lie motionless. In a cold, dark universe whose sun was extinguished eons ago, Amra felt the movement of life, alien and unguessed. An earthquake had him in its grip and was shaking him to and fro, at the same time chafing his hands and feet, until he yelled in pain and fury and groped for his sword.
"He's coming to, Horsa," grunted a voice. "Haste! We must rub the frost out of his limbs if he's ever to wield sword again."
"He won't open his left hand,"
growled another, his voice indicating muscular strain.
"He's clutching something."
Amra opened his eyes and stared into the bearded faces that bent over him. He was surrounded by tall, golden-haired warriors in mail and furs.
"Amra, you live!"
"By Crom, Njord,"
gasped he.
"Am I alive, or are we all dead and in Valhalla?"
"We live,"
grunted the Aesir, busy over Amra's half-frozen feet.
"We had to fight our way through an ambush, else we had come up with you before the battle was joined. The corpses were scarce cold when we came upon the field. We did not find you among the dead, so we followed your spoor. In Ymir's name, Amra, why did you wander off into the wastes of the north? We have followed your tracks in the snow for hours. Had a blizzard come up and hidden them, we had never found you by Ymir."
"Swear not so often by Ymir," muttered a warrior, glancing at the distant mountains. "This is his land, and the god bides among yonder mountains, the legends say."
"I followed a woman," Amra answered hazily. "We met Braji's men in the plains. I know not how long we fought. I alone lived. I was dizzy and faint. The land lay like a dream before me. Only now do all things seem natural and familiar. The woman came and taunted me. She was beautiful as a frozen flame from hell. When I looked at her, I was as one mad and forgot all else in the world. I followed her. Did you not find her tracks, or the giants in icy mail I slew?"
Njord shook his head.
"We found only your tracks in the snow, Amra."
"Then it may be I was mad," said Amra dazedly. "Yet you yourself are no more real to me than was the golden-haired witch who fled naked across the snows before me. Yet from my very hands she vanished in icy flame."
"He is delirious,"
whispered a warrior.
"Not so,"
cried an older man, whose eyes were wild and weird.
"It was Atali, the daughter of Ymir, the frost giant. To fields of the dead she comes, and shows herself to the dying. Myself, when a boy, I saw her, when I lay half-slain on the bloody field of Woolraven. I saw her walking among the dead in the snows, her naked body gleaming like ivory, and her golden hair like a blinding flame in the moonlight. I lay and howled like a dying dog because I could not crawl after her. She lures men from stricken fields into the wastelands to be slain by her brothers, the ice giants, who lay men's red hearts smoking on Ymir's board. Amra has seen Atali, the frost giant's daughter."
"Bah!"
grunted Horsa.
"Old Gorm's mind was turned in his youth by a sword cut on the head. Amra was delirious with the fury of battle. Look how his helmet is dinted. Any of those blows might have addled his brain. It was an hallucination he followed into the wastes. He is from the south. What does he know of Atali?"
"You speak truth, perhaps," muttered Amra. "It was all strange and weird, by Crom."
He broke off, glaring at the object that still dangled from his clenched left fist. The others gaped silently at the veil he held up, a wisp of gossamer that was never spun by human distaff. End of section 4. Section 5 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Legacy by Kenneth B. Pritchard. My friend Frederick Brown and I are lawyers. Lawyers often come up against strange cases, but the case that Brown had a while ago was the oddest and by far the most weird I have ever heard of. Brown and I were lunching together one noon, when the subject was broached of the peculiar things that one sometimes meets up with. "James," said Fred, "you never had anything happen to you that can compare with a certain case of mine. I'll wager on it." "Shoot," I said. "Let's have an earful. What's it all about?" "I had a legacy," he began without hesitation, "a few weeks ago, that was void to all concerned unless it was signed by one man. All others involved had attached their signatures to the documents, but Ogleman's, that was his name, was missing." "You mean the Ogleman that died a short time ago?" I broke in. "The same," Brown admonished. "I must hasten to add," he went on, "that a time limit was set on this certain day in which the signatures must be obtained. Ogleman was not in town. The final limit was set for 8 p.m. For days before the last one arrived, my client had me sending out feelers in all directions, trying to contact this one man. The evening before the final day, I at last got in touch with him, and he promised to come without delay. He wired back that he would leave in the morning, as he was situated in a place where transportation facilities were not the best. All I could do then was wait. 10 o'clock the next morning, I received a telegram. Ogleman had been struck by a speeding auto. But as I read further, I realized that the man would arrive anyway. His condition I did not know, as the message had imparted no more than the 2 facts I have already given. It was 7:30 that evening that the missing man showed up at my client's home. He was quite a sight, I can assure you. My friend paused as though to reflect upon the unusual scene. His eyes widened for a moment in sudden horror, and then he continued in his regular manner. I found myself looking at him as I shook his one good hand. The other arm was in a sling that had been hastily made. His head had a bandage around it, and his face was white, almost the color of several patches adhering to it. My client shook hands with him also. "Glad you came, Ogleman," he said. "Everything depends on you, you know." "Yes," said Ogleman as he relinquished his hand. "I know that the legacy must be signed." His voice seemed strangely hollow and unnatural, and there was an unreal appearance about the man. He turned to me. I shuddered somewhat at the bits of blood that had caked on the bandages. "We must hurry," he said. "The time is short. Have you the papers ready?" he asked eagerly. "Yes," I replied. "Everything is ready." "Come over to the table with me. There is a chair there, and you can sit down and sign." I felt that he would collapse if he did not be seated soon. I handed him the pen and gave him the papers, showing him where to sign. Being hurt as he was, it was very difficult for him to write. However, he managed to scrawl his name on the last sheet. All was legal then. I took the pen from his hand and said, "Now it is done. There won't be any more trouble over it." I somehow forced a smile. My client beamed approvingly, but Ogleman never stirred. I looked at him. He pitched forward on the table. I was greatly alarmed and hastened my client to summon a doctor. Ogleman was dead. "I've heard of tales like that before," I remarked dryly. "Maybe," rejoined Brown. "But the doctor said that Ogleman had been dead for 10 hours. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Ancient Voice by Eando Binder. First of all, I want to say that Norman Ross was normal. What I mean is that there was nothing odd or peculiar about him. He was just a common, ordinary, likable, erring human being like the rest of us. I say this now so that at the end of the story you won't have any illusions about him. Sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't escape all this. These tossing nights of sleeplessness, that awakening in a cold sweat of horror, the tortured thoughts that rack my brain continuously. It would be so easy. A quiet, dark night, the rippling water, one splash and it would be done. Perhaps I will be driven to it. I feel that way sometimes. But I will tell the story as best I can. Norman Ross and I were operators for the International Radio News Service. Thrown together by chance, we had become good friends in the 2 years before this happened. We had always been on the day shift and handled calls from Europe. We liked the work and got good pay and often went out together for a little recreation. That is why I can say that Norman Ross was normal. 2 years of friendship means a lot. Well, one day just after working hours, Hegstrom, our boss, called us into his office, both of us together. "Boys," he said, "I need 2 operators for Central Asia calls in the night shift. I've always had my eye on you two, and I'm going to offer the positions to you two first. There's a little more responsibility and difficulty, but the pay is higher. Then it's night work. Do you want it? Think it over and tell me tomorrow. It's nothing compulsory." We thought it over that evening, over glasses of beer, and decided to take it for a change. Hegstrom was pleased. So we took up the night work. A veteran Oriental call operator broke us in the first night, and then we went on our own. We found the work mightily interesting. Many of the calls came in broken English. You know, the English that a foreigner speaks, that he learned from a book. I handled Persia and a couple of little countries with funny names. My friend Ross took the calls from China. It was a little odd at first, getting used to being alone. When we had the day shift, we were only 2 out of 15 operators taking calls from Europe. In the night shift, the big room was empty except for us two. The sound of our typewriters was always extra loud in the silence. But we got used to it, and inside 3 weeks didn't mind the loneliness a bit. We had a chance to talk to each other occasionally, if Ross and I both happened to get short calls at the same time and had to wait for the next ones. But the rest of the time the calls kept us busy, taking the messages from the Far East. We had a little trouble, too, getting used to sleeping in daylight. Even with the blinds down, you can't forget it's daylight outside, and that makes it hard to go to sleep. Neither of us was married, so we would hop right home after work. Ross lived with an uncle and aunt. I roomed alone and sleep until middle afternoon. Then we'd dress up and have a meal together, and later roam around together looking for diversion. With the increased pay we got for the night work, we were able to see all kinds of expensive shows. Our lady companions liked that, and we had just about a choice of any. Then, after the show, we would steer to some beer garden. Thank the Lord Prohibition was repealed 10 years ago. And laugh and talk the hours away. Ross and I would boast about our work and tell the girls strange and a bit distorted stories of some of the calls we took in from the mysterious East. But I had better leave these abstract ruminations and return to the story. Only I wanted to show you that Norman Ross was really normal in all respects. Then, too, it eases my troubled mind now to think back to those happy days. Days that will never be again. It was just a month after our transfer that it all happened. Ross was sitting as usual with one leg off the floor, the heel of his shoe on a big throw switch on the control panel. It was a dead switch, though, that had never been taken out. Down low, close to his stomach, was the typewriter, and he typed with his elbows resting on the arms of the chair. It was his own chair that he had bought for that particular purpose, because he said he couldn't do any work with the regular armless chair that other operators used. He had used that chair for 2 years. Hegstrom didn't care a bit so long as he did his work and did it good. Personally, I think Ross had a spark of laziness in him. Well, the particular night this whole story centers about... Now my hand is trembling. I hate to go on, but I must. It will explain things to others. Anyway, Ross was embedded as per custom with that right leg of his in the air. During ordinary calls, he would slowly swing his toe back and forth as his heel rested on the dead switch. Once in a while, it would stop, and then I would know that something a little exciting was coming to him. War news from the north, or perhaps a bandit raid in the stormy western part of China. His typewriter, too, would clack a little sharper as he bore down harder on the keys. It was along about 3 a.m. that we had a breathing spell after we both had short calls. We discussed a few clipped plans for the following evening and which of the ladies we would take out. When Ross talked to me, he wouldn't budge an inch. He would merely twist his neck in my direction and talk with that toe of his swinging lazily. We both kept our eye on the clock so that we wouldn't be late for a call. Hegstrom would get mighty fussy over complaints from the Central Wave Traffic Office that operators at our station took calls late, even a few seconds. So about half a minute before his next call was due, Ross turned from me with a sigh. That is, turned his neck back and stretched a lazy hand to the dial to get ready for the carrier wave. My next call wasn't due for another 2 minutes, so I watched my friend without any particular purpose in mind. He reached a slow hand to his head and adjusted the phones on his ears a bit. Then both his hands dropped into position above the typewriter, and I heard him say tonelessly, "Call, XXW2, call." And then his voice clipped off like a voice in a broadcast clips off when a tube blows out. Watching him, I saw first that toe of his stop swinging. Something important, I thought to myself. But then I began to sit up tense. In the first place, Ross hadn't touched his keys. In the second place, he leaned forward in his chair and dropped his leg to the floor. Now, that may sound silly that I mentioned his leg dropping to the floor, but to a person that knew Ross as well as I did, that is something. I'd never seen it happen before. I sat up stiff as a board. He had just reached up his two hands to the phones and was pressing them closer to his ears like the message was faint. Now I knew something big was up, and I jumped from my chair. "What's got into you, Norm?" I said, getting in front of him. But he didn't seem to hear me or know I was there. He only pressed the earphones tighter. When I looked at his face, I was shocked. Only once before had I ever seen that rapt expression. When he got the call from London 2 years before at the end of the 3-month war, telling how the whole city had been gassed and bombed, leaving not one soul alive. I looked at the clock. It was a minute past the time for his regular call. I shook his shoulder. "Listen here, Norm," I yelled. "You've got to get that call, or—" "Listen to this, Bob," he cut in, handing me the phones. I put them about my ears. All I heard was a faint voice. I pressed the phones close, as Ross had done. Then I distinguished it. In strangely muffled tones, the voice came in, full of sharp hissing sounds and hard consonants. I could understand not a word. I tore off the phones. "You fool," I cried. "What's the idea of listening to some foreign station? Look," I pointed to the clock. "You're over a minute late on your regular call." Ross pointed to the wavelength dial. "See," he said. "I've got it on the right wave. 18.75 meters. I stared a moment in bewilderment. Sure enough, it was where it should be. "Sure you want 18.75? Better check," I cried, in a small panic, thinking of what Hegstrom would say. Ross gave me a withering glance which said without words, "Sure I want it? Did I ever lose my memory?" "Well, I can't fuss around here," I said with a hasty glance at the clock. "My call is due in about 10 seconds. Before I took my call, I cried to my friend, "Probably something wrong with the dial control. You better try and find your call on some other number." Then I snapped my button. The carrier wave was already coming in. I caught my call just in time. Call, XXW2, ZZ5, I spluttered. Next minute I was busily typing the routine news from Persia. With everything going along smoothly, I turned my eyes in Ross's direction. A good operator can do anything with his eyes while taking routine news. He can even use half his brain to think about other things. I saw Ross playing with the dial and felt relieved that he was taking my suggestion that something had gone wrong with the works, so that the dial was in error. Hegstrom would be awful sore when he got the complaint that Ross had failed to get his call. But then I would be witness that it wasn't his fault at all, that some foreign station had come in on that wavelength and spoiled the regular call. Only, it was funny. It came to me then that the regular call hadn't registered at all. I hadn't heard a background of English in the few seconds I listened to the foreigner. Maybe something had happened to the station in China. I turned my eyes back to my favorite spot, a dull paint spot on the panel, because I was getting some technical stuff and needed to concentrate. When I next looked at Ross about 2 minutes later, I heaved a mighty sigh of relief. He was picking at the keys, taking his call. Only one thing bothered me. His leg was still on the floor. Oh well, I thought to myself, that upset him so much that he's a bit off-center. And with this philosophy, I went on with my call in a much more peaceful frame of mind. I finished my call in about 15 minutes, and then I had a breathing spell of 4. I looked at Ross. He still had that leg of his down on the floor, and worse yet, his elbows were not resting on the arms of the chair. They were in the air, and he was sitting up in his chair, stiff as a knife. But he was peacefully typing out his call, so, after all, everything was all right. I did notice one other thing, but not until later did it become significant. His face, as much of his expression as I could get from a side view, had a look of... I know now what it was, although then I couldn't get it. Amazement. Stark, bewildered amazement. Restless as I could be while waiting for my next call, I walked to a position just behind Ross to see what it was that had so excited him that his foot was on the floor and his elbows in the air. I bent down close to see what he had typewritten, and then blinked my eyes. The stuff he was taking down was not English any way you look at it. It was a mess of consonants and S's that sent chills up my spine. "Listen here," I shouted when I got my wits back. "Listen, Ross, what in heaven's name are you doing? What in thunder is that stuff?" But Ross kept right on typing as if his life depended on it. Only in one way did he show that he had heard me. He tossed his head sharply once in an unmistakable gesture for me to let him alone. From this point on, my blood pressure rose and my heart pounded. My heart had been pounding ever since then, even when I forget for a moment about all this. I automatically looked at the clock and saw that my next call was due. I calmed down somewhat as I pecked down the routine news, but I felt a growing fear in my heart as time and again I looked over to my friend to see him typing like a robot, his foot on the floor, elbows in the air. Then my friend, my only real pal, was going crazy. How that thought tortured me. I knew perfectly well that he didn't know any other language than English. Why in the wide world should he be clacking down something he didn't understand? It was just 3:30 that suddenly Ross ripped the headphones off and dropped them to the floor. He stood a moment looking at the paper in his hand, and I noticed then that his skin was deadly white. I couldn't stand it anymore. I jerked off my own phones and ran to him. Call or no call, I couldn't stand by while my pal was in danger of losing his mind or something else as bad. "Norm!" I cried. "For God's sake, tell me what it is. What—" But I didn't finish. With an explosion of curses, Ross crumpled the paper in his hand and began to walk up and down the room. He was so unconscious of everything else that he bumped squarely into me, reeled a moment, and then went on racing up and down feverishly. I tried to stop him, grabbed his arm and jerked it, but Ross was a much bigger and stronger fellow than I am, and he went on without noticing me. He didn't shake me off, you understand, but just tore on as if he hadn't even felt my hand. I didn't say anything because I had lost my voice looking at the terrible picture of his face twisted in some agony of his mind. Then he began to speak, throwing his hands about hopelessly and swinging his head like a maniac while I just stood there, out of the path of his walk, panting like I had run 10 miles, and listened. "Great God in heaven!" he cried in a voice that I hoped never to hear again in reality, although I hear it every night in my tortured dreams. "It can't be! It's impossible! I'm going mad! I am mad! What did I ever do to deserve this? How can it be? Oh, how can it be?" For a while he just repeated those things until I wanted to scream out in frenzy, but I didn't do a thing. I could see he was beyond my reach, beyond anybody's reach. Then his voice changed. It became low, full of intense energy, ominously quiet. "What did he say? He said the weather had become frigidly cold, that it would not be long, that soon the ice would cover the whole earth." Then he stopped a moment, his eyes burned maniacally. "But I know something about geology. That was over 50,000 years ago. Do you hear me?" He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to himself. "Do you get that? 50,000 years ago." His voice became low and intense again, so that my blood turned to water. "What did he say? He said to his friend that the land was being flooded with creatures, maddened men and frenzied animals that were retreating before the ice. The ice. But good God, I tell you that was 50,000 years ago." Then his voice became high-pitched and sobbing. "Oh, dear Mary and our one God, release me from this mad dream. Save me from the destruction that will overwhelm me. How can it be? It's impossible. How can it be?" He repeated that dozens of times while he rumpled his hair and ground his teeth. I mustered up courage and grabbed him by the shoulders. Next moment I was spinning backward and hit the wall with a thump. I fell down and stayed there, looking up at Ross with an expression that I sometimes wonder could be. I know my eyes became salty with tears of mental agony. Maybe it was blood that I sweated out that night. Then I heard him again, head to one side, staggering like a drunken man. "The radio was only invented 25 years ago. This was 50,000 years ago. What did he say? He said to his friend that this would probably be his last broadcast as the heat coils were running out. 'Goodbye,' he said. 'Goodbye, my friend. Civilization is doomed. The ice will cover all. But I know something about geology, I tell you. That was over 50,000 years ago. Do you see what that means?' He paused as if expecting an answer, but I knew, my chilled brain told me, that he wasn't talking to me, didn't know I was there. He was still arguing with himself. 'You see, it means that I have received a message broadcast 50,000 years ago, just before the ice came. That's what it means. Do you hear me?' Then he fell into a senseless jargon that I knew meant the coming of the end of his mind's fortitude. It would collapse soon. And then, came his voice to me, a blood-curdling knife of a voice.
And then? How can you explain that I understood that voice? Tell me that. I never heard that language before. It was just a jumble at first, and then in a flash, I understood it, just as if I had lived there 50,000 years ago.
His voice became a wild shriek, a voice that a ghost might have.
Oh, Savior! God, how can it be? How can it be?
That was all. I sprang to my feet joyfully as I could after passing through that, and ran to him. The light of madness had died out of his eyes. He had seen me and recognized me. His shoulders drooped as if he carried the weight of a world on them. With a babble of sobs and broken cries, I threw my arms around him and thanked the Lord he had been saved. He gently disengaged me.
"Okay, Bob," he said weakly. "I'm over it now."
"Darn right you are," I said more calmly, realizing I must show a braver front than I had. "And what's more, we're going to get out of here." I took him to the door of his uncle's house and left him there, satisfied that the crisis was over. Then I went back to the station and finished up my calls. How I had the courage and fortitude to do it, I don't know. Before the day shift came in, before I did a lot of explaining how Ross had been suddenly taken sick in the stomach and had to go home, I picked up a crumpled piece of paper from the floor, tore it into little bits, and threw the confetti in a wastepaper basket. I got the news when I went to my room. Norman Ross had committed suicide at 7 o'clock in the morning. That was an hour after I'd left him at his door. I told Hegstrom plain out that I wouldn't work that night shift anymore for love or money. He said he'd have me transferred, but would I stay one more night until he got a new man? Like a fool, I agreed. It was 3 a.m. that next night that I turned the dial to where the China station should come in that had failed once. I sat petrified for 5 seconds while I listened to a muffled voice that spoke in hisses and sharp consonants. I tore the earphones off my head, smashed them against the panel with all my strength, and dashed out of the room. I remember seeing the other operator, the one who had taken my calls, popping his eyes out. Then I was out in the cool air, panting like I had been running for hours. So it is that I wonder if I shouldn't escape at all. Tossing nights, cold sweats of stark terror, a tortured, fevered brain. It would be so easy. A dark night. Real dark, so no one would see me and try to stop me. Then the cool water to moisten my feverish brow. Nice, cool water, inviting water. Just one little splash. Not a noisy one. No one would know. No one would care. No one would understand. Just one splash. And then peace. My friends tell me not to take on so over the death of my one and only pal. They do not know the story. I have told no one. My friends, they tell me there is a haunted look in my eyes, that lines are deepening in my face. They tell me to buck up, to face life squarely. But I can't. I simply can't. I'll tell you why. After that night when I ripped out the earphones and blew a fuse in the station by short-circuiting a switch on the panel, I found that out later. I went back in answer to a call from Hegstrom. He was very kind and sympathetic, wanted to know what had caused me to act so strangely the night before. Also wanted to know what had caused Ross's suicide. Hegstrom is sharp. He saw the connection. But I clamped my jaws together and refused to say anything. Then Hegstrom asked if the thing he held in his hand had anything to do with Ross. I took the paper. Then I think I gasped or screamed or something. It was a paper filled with some of that balderdash that Ross had written that night. He must have filled 2 sheets and I only destroyed 1. I left Hegstrom as mystified as ever, but I had that paper in my pocket. I had a plan to save my sanity. I took the paper to a professor at a college, a professor famous as a language specialist, ancient and modern. I gave him the paper and $100. He afterwards returned the money and asked him to find out from what country or place it came from. I got my answer a week later. There was no such language in either the modern or recorded ancient times. End of section 6. Section 7. of the weird fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Polaris by H.P. Lovecraft. Into the north window of my chamber glows the pole star with uncanny light. All through the long hellish hours of blackness it shines there, and in the autumn of the year when the winds from the north curse and whine, and the red-leaved trees of the swamp mutter things to one another in the small hours of the morning under the horned, waning moon, I sit by the casement and watch that star. Down from the heights reels the glittering Cassiopeia as the hours wear on, while Charles Wayne lumbers up from behind the vapor-soaked swamp trees that sway in the night wind. Just before dawn, Arcturus winks ruddily from above the cemetery on the low hillock, and Coma Berenice's shimmers weirdly afar off in the mysterious east, but still the pole star leers down from the same place in the black vault, winking hideously like an insane watching eye which strives to convey some strange message, yet recalls nothing save that it once had a message to convey. Sometimes, when it is cloudy, I can sleep. Well do I remember the night of the great aurora, when over the swamp played the shocking coruscations of the demon light. After the beam came clouds, and then I slept. And it was under a horned waning moon that I saw the city for the first time. Still and somnolent did it lie, on a strange plateau in a hollow betwixt strange peaks. Of ghastly marble were its walls and its towers, its columns, domes, and pavements. In the marble street were marble pillars, the upper parts of which were carven into the images of grave bearded men. The air was warm and stirred not, and overhead, scarce 10 degrees from the zenith, glowed that watching pole star. Long did I gaze on the city, but the day came not. When the red Aldebaran, which blinked low in the sky but never set, had crawled a quarter of the way around the horizon, I saw light and motion in the houses, in the streets. Forms strangely robed, but at once noble and familiar, walked abroad, and under the horned waning moon, men talked wisdom in a tongue which I understood, though it was unlike any language I had ever known. And when the red Aldebaran had crawled more than halfway around the horizon, there were again darkness and silence. When I awaked, I was not as I had been. Upon my memory was graven the vision of the city, and within my soul had arisen another and vaguer recollection, of whose nature I was not then certain. Thereafter, on the cloudy nights when I could sleep, I saw the city often, sometimes under that horned waning moon, and sometimes under the hot yellow rays of a sun which did not set, but which wheeled low around the horizon. And on the clear nights the pole star leered as never before. Gradually I came to wonder what might be my place in that city on the strange plateau betwixt strange peaks. At first, content to view the scene as an all-observant, uncorporeal presence, I now desired to define my relation to it, and to speak my mind amongst the grave men who conversed each day in the public squares. I said to myself, this is no dream, for by what means can I prove the greater reality of that other life in the house of stone and brick south of the sinister swamp, and the cemetery on the low hillock, where the pole star peeps into my north window each night? One night, as I listened to the discourse in the large square containing many statues, I felt a change, and perceived that I had at last a bodily form. Nor was a stranger in the streets of Olatho, which lies on the plateau of Sarkis, betwixt the peaks of Noton and Cadaphonic. It was my friend Alos who spoke, and his speech was one that pleased my soul, for it was the speech of a true man and patriot. That night had the news come on Dikos' fall, and of the advance of the Inatos, squat, hellish yellow fiends who 5 years ago had appeared out of the unknown west to ravage the confines of our kingdom, and finally to besiege our towns. Having taken the fortified places at the foot of the mountains, their way now lay open to the plateau, unless every citizen could resist with the strength of 10 men. For the squat creatures were mightily in the arts of war, and knew not the scruples of honor which hold back our tall gray-eyed men of Lomar from ruthless conquest. Alos, my friend, was commander of all the forces on the plateau, and in him lay the last hope of our country. On this occasion he spoke of the perils to be faced and exhorted the men of Olatho, bravest of the Lomarians, to sustain the traditions of their ancestors, who were forced to move southward from Zobna before the advance of the great ice sheet. even as our descendants must some day flee from the land of Lomar. Valiantly and victoriously swept aside the hairy, long-armed cannibal Nopkes that stood in their way. To me, Alos denied a warrior's part, for I was feeble and given to strange faintings when subjected to stress and hardships. But my eyes were the keenest in the city, despite the long hours I gave each day to the study of the Narcotic manuscripts and the wisdom of the Zobnarian fathers. So my friend, desiring not to doom me to inaction, rewarded me with that duty which was second to nothing in importance. To the watchtower of Thopnin he sent me, there to serve as the eyes of our army. Should the Inutos attempt to gain the citadel by the narrow pass behind the peak Noton, and there surprise the garrison, I was to give the signal of fire which would warn the waiting soldiers and save the town from immediate disaster. Alone I mounted the tower, for every man of stout body was needed in the passes below. My brain was sore dazed with excitement and fatigue, for I had not slept in many days. Yet was my purpose firm, for I loved my native land of Lomar and the marble city Olatho that lies betwixt the peaks of Noton and Cataphonec. But as I stood in the tower's topmost chamber, I beheld the horned waning moon, red and sinister, quivering through vapors that hovered over the distant valley of Banoff, and through an opening in the roof glittered the pale pole star, fluttering as if alive, and leering like a fiend and tempter. Methought its spirit whispered evil counsel, soothing me to traitorous somnolence with a damnable rhythmical promise which it repeated over and over. Slumber, watcher, till the spheres, 26,000 years, have revolved, and I return to the spot where now I burn. Other stars anon shall rise to the axis of the skies, stars that soothe and stars that bless with a sweet forgetfulness. Only when my round is o'er shall the past disturb thy door. Vainly did I struggle with my drowsiness, seeking to connect these strange words with some lore of the skies which I had learnt from the Narcotic manuscripts. My head, heavy and reeling, drooped to my breast, and when next I looked up it was in a dream, with the pole star grinning at me through a window from over the horrible swaying trees of a dream swamp. And I am still dreaming. In my shame and despair I sometimes scream frantically, begging the dream creatures around me to waken me ere the Inutos steal up the pass behind the peak Noton and take the citadel by surprise. But these creatures are demons, for they laugh at me and tell me I am not dreaming. They mock me whilst I sleep, and whilst the squat yellow foe may be creeping silently upon us. I have failed in my duty and betrayed the marble city of Olatho. I have proven false to Alos, my friend and commander. But still these shadows of my dreams deride me. They say there is no land of Lomar save in my nocturnal imaginings, that in those realms where the pole star shines high and red Aldebaran crawls low around the horizon, there had been naught save ice and snow for thousands of years, and never a man save squat yellow creatures blighted by the cold whom they call Esquimaux. And as I writhe in my guilty agony, frantic to save the city whose peril every moment grows, and vainly striving to shake off this unnatural dream of a house of stone and brick south of a sinister swamp and a cemetery on a low hillock, the pole star, evil and monstrous, leers down from the black vault, winking hideously like an insane watching eye which strives to convey some message, yet recalls nothing save that it once had a message to convey. End of section 7. Section 8 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Phantom Lights by August Derleth. Of the 4 men sitting in the captain's cabin on the SS Maine, 3 were listening to Captain Henderson, who was talking of storms in general, an apt topic, since the Maine had been driven head-on into a raging tropical gale and was at the moment making very little headway. The 4 of them, including the captain himself, were somewhat bored, though none of them showed it. Wimbler, the businessman, had begun to toy with his spectacles, taking them off, folding them, and putting them back on. Allison, the tall, dark man, who was ostensibly a writer, occasionally whispered in an undertone to his companion, whose name had been given as Talbot. It was Wimbler who broke suddenly into the captain's monologue.
Have we stopped? Doesn't seem as if we were moving at all.
The captain shook his head.
No, we've been going very slowly on account of the gale.
Then he stopped talking abruptly.
We have stopped,
he said, and got up. At the same moment, a sharp rap on the cabin door brought the other 3 men to attention. The captain shouted, "Come!" A tousled head of red hair first appeared in the small opening, and after it a youngish face that seemed to emerge from the hair.
"What is it, Munro?"
asked Captain Henderson.
"The anchor's gone out, sir. Torn out of its holdings by the storm. We can't seem to be able to draw it back. Attached to something, most likely."
The captain pondered this a moment. Then he made an abrupt gesture with his hand.
"Well, leave it until this infernal storm is past. We weren't making time anyway. Give the order to shut down the engines, then try to find out just about where we are, and report back to me."
"Very well, sir."
The captain sat down again.
"Happens once in a lifetime,"
he explained. He shrugged his shoulders and tried to smile genially. His mood was not for it.
"There's nothing to be done."
His listeners nodded sympathetically. Then the 4 of them sat in silence until another rap on the cabin door brought them again to alertness. Again Munro appeared in response to the captain's call.
"I've inquired of the first mate, sir," he said, "as to our bearings. He has no idea where we are. He asked the radio operator to broadcast to see what he can get. We are somewhere about the Moluccas, he thinks, or more probably Java. Seems to be something wrong with our compasses, sir."
The captain nodded ponderously.
"Most likely the storm, or some other magnetic influence. You may go, Munro, but if anything crops up, report to me immediately."
Munro vanished, drawing the cabin door shut behind him. The captain shook his head dolefully and waited to see whether one of the other men might say something. No one ventured, so he began once more.
"I didn't think we had got as far as Java," he said. "But you can't ever tell."
Wimbler looked up suddenly and spoke.
"Say, isn't this the 27th of February?"
"No, the 26th,
said the captain evenly. He looked at his clock for verification, but found it not.
"I'm sorry," he said at once. "It is the 27th. I had no idea it was after midnight."
Wimbler nodded.
"A year ago this morning, the Cumberland went down off the coast of Java."
Captain Hinderland snatched at the change of subject.
"That was quite a mystery, as I remember it. There were only a few survivors, I think,"
Wimbler said.
"Only one. The first mate. They got some ugly rumors out about him shortly after he appeared. Said he'd blown up the ship during the storm."
"His wife went down, too, if I'm not mistaken,"
said the captain, as if questioning Wimbler's suggestion. Wimbler nodded.
"They said it was partly because of her that he did it. There was another man on board, and I understand there'd been bad blood between the mate and this man on account of his wife. Then, too, the first mate had had a terrible time with the captain and wanted to get even with him. Did the thing in a moment of madness."
The captain looked at him for a moment without seeming to see him. Talbot spoke suddenly.
"All of which goes to show how oddly unfounded rumors come up. We know that no one but the first mate survived the disaster, and yet someone got out those rumors about him."
The captain nodded.
"You speak about it as if you'd seen it all," he said, turning to Wimbler.
Wimbler laughed.
"I knew the first mate pretty well, and I knew what he was capable of doing when he got jealous. His wife was a most attractive woman."
"You think he really sent the Cumberland down, then?" asked the captain.
"I know he did," said Wimbler shortly.
"Nonsense," snapped Talbot with unexpected sharpness.
"Only the first mate would know that, and unless he's told you, you couldn't know."
Wimbler looked at him curiously.
"He didn't tell me, but his wife did."
Talbot looked as if he might explode, then abruptly he said,
"Oh, I see. Spiritualism."
And thus he dismissed the subject. The door of the cabin opened suddenly, and Munro looked in.
"Something wrong, sir," he said.
What is it?"
asked Henderson.
"Lights on the water. It looks like a ship sinking, or else we're close to Java."
Munro paused.
"Will you come, sir?"
The captain nodded shortly and turned to his companions.
"If you gentlemen would care to come along. This promises to be interesting. There are greatcoats in the closet over there."
Munro led the way to the upper deck. The 4 men followed after him, bracing themselves against the gale. On the upper deck they were met by the first mate. Captain Henderson raised his binoculars and stared vainly into the pall of darkness, broken every few minutes by vivid, jagged flashes of lightning. Huge waves obstructed his vision at regular intervals.
"Can't see a thing!"
he shouted. Then he swept the raging sea and sky once more. Abruptly, lights on the water came into view.
"There they are!"
shouted the first mate.
"Java lights!"
said the captain. The first mate shouted again.
No, not Java, sir.
They wouldn't bob about like that." The lights were coming closer now. The first mate raised his binoculars and fixed them on the approaching lights. "That's a ship, sure," he said.
"Any distress signal?"
asked the captain.
"No."
"Odd. Ship's in distress. Plain as pikestaff."
Monroe had been peering through his glasses in silence. He lowered them suddenly and turned to the captain. "Some lettering just now, sir. I saw it quite clearly. An M and the end of a word, which I took to be land."
"English ship, then,"
shouted the captain.
Yes."
The first mate raised his glasses.
"I can see the lettering, but I'm damned if I can make it out."
A man came along the deck toward the little group, breasting the furious wind. It had stopped raining now, and the lightning flashes were not as frequent as they had been. Even the wind had lessened considerably. Monroe saw the oncoming man and shouted to the captain.
"Here's our distress signal, sir."
The man came up to them and handed a tightly folded slip of paper to the captain. Henderson opened the paper, and with the aid of the first mate's flashlight, read,
"HMS Cumberland calling.
Send Harry to us."
"What's this?"
shouted the captain.
"Mr. Rogers got only those words, sir, nothing more."
"Must be some mistake."
"No mistake, sir. I heard that come in myself." The first mate shouted suddenly,
"The lights have vanished."
Even as he spoke, there came a sudden brilliant flash in the sky, a flash that was not made by lightning, followed by a thunderous detonation. Then came a sound that held them, fascinated them, a sound fraught with terror. A woman's voice, clear as a bell, calling from where the lights had been, the voice distinct above the roar of the wind.
"Harry! Harry! Harry!"
The wind brought the sound to them, magnifying it, subduing it. Immediately after came a chorus of voices, calling as if from a great distance.
"Harry! Harry! Come to us! Come!"
The woman's voice, yet strong above them all. The captain muttered something incoherent. Then he turned to the three men who had followed him from the cabin and shouted, waving the message from the radio operator.
"Cumberland calling! Something's wrong!"
One of the three launched himself suddenly forward, striking Captain Henderson and pushing him violently aside. He sprawled on the deck, but felt hands helping him to his feet almost immediately. At the same moment, the voice of Monroe came to him, shouting,
"Man overboard! Man overboard!"
"Good God!"
shouted the captain.
"Shut up, Monroe. We can't send anyone out there to look for him."
He swung about and looked at the men grouped about him. Almost at once he saw that the man named Allison was missing. Wembler pushed himself forward, his face white and drawn.
"You wouldn't find him, Captain," he said, shaking his head. "You'd never find him. Harry Allison was first mate on the Cumberland a year ago. He wasn't Allison then, and he was my brother-in-law."
The captain waved his arm toward the place where the lights had been.
"And that?"
he shouted frenziedly.
"What was all that?"
Wembler's hand closed over Henderson's arm.
"You heard, Captain. It was the Cumberland sinking, just as she did a year ago when that blackguard blew her up. And I heard my sister's voice calling to Allison, and the others. The souls of those people he killed in his devilish jealousy came back for him."
End of section 8. Section 9 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. A Visit to Jules de Grandin by Mary Ann Ferguson. I got off the train at Harrisonville Railroad Station filled with mixed feelings, for I was to visit the world-renowned detective Jules de Grandin and Dr. Trowbridge. As I walked uncertainly up the street, I inquired of a policeman, who directed me to Jules de Grandin's house. I'm afraid that I knocked at the door somewhat timidly, and I soon heard footsteps coming down the hall. The door opened, and there stood a tall, dark man. "Is this where Mr. de Grandin lives?" I asked rather shakily, for I had been anticipating this eventful visit for several months, during which time I had reacted this scene many times.
"Yes," the man replied. "I am Dr. Trowbridge. Will you please come in?"
I entered just as a voice from within called out,
"Who was it, friend Trowbridge?"
We entered a large cheery room, and seated in a deep study chair, I saw Jules de Grandin. His blond hair sleek and shining. He looked up from the magazine he had been reading, and seeing me, arose, and stroking his blond mustache, said,
"What can we do for you, my dear young lady?"
Suddenly my knees seemed to turn to water. "Mr. de Grandin," I managed to whisper, "I've always wanted to see you in person. I hope you will forgive my intrusion." Jules de Grandin waved me to a seat with his long artistic hand, and seeing a silver-topped walking stick in the corner, I asked, "Is that the famous walking stick which vanquished the werewolf in The Thing in the Fog?"
"Eh bien, of a truth, my young friend," he admitted. "If it were not for the concealed sword in the center, I would have been in too many tight places for comfort."
"Mr. de Grandin, will you please tell how many years you have been interested in this line of investigation?" I asked.
"Oh, tiens, my young lady, I have been actively engaged for the past 8 years in this thrilling occupation."
"I am sorry that I weren't acquainted with your adventures right from the start," I confessed. "Weren't you afraid in some of the gruesome cases, such as the Bleeding Mummy and the Band of Glory?"
"Eh bien," he answered, "my friend, if one allows himself to let fear enter his heart, he is already defeated, and I know that I have the good one in my favor."
"Well, Mr. de Grandin and Dr. Trowbridge, thank you for this delightful talk," I began, when a blood-curdling moan echoed through the house. De Grandin, Dr. Trowbridge, and I ran to where the moan seemed to come from, but nothing was there. I imagined that I must have turned pale, for Dr. Trowbridge caught hold of my arm and gave me a glass of water containing some sort of restorative. As I began to feel better, my color came back, and de Grandin said, "My friend, your train leaves in 20 minutes, so, friend Trowbridge, get out of your car and take the young lady to the station." "But how about that moan?" I asked.
"Mon Dieu!"
he exclaimed, though less excited than would be expected under the circumstances.
"But I, Jules de Grandin, shall soon find out."
Gathering up my purse, I arose and gave my hand to de Grandin. Then Dr. Trowbridge took me to the station. Safely in my compartment, I suddenly realized how tired I was. So, leaning back in my seat and closing my eyes, I drifted into the land of dreams, into the realm of deathless visions, where hazy phantasms of the imagination take one through glorious adventures, in which earthly realities become as nothing. End of section 9. Section 10 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. Thither Ghoul often retired in the daytime to read in quiet the marvelous annals of the Jinns, the chronicles of ancient worlds, and the prophecies relating to the worlds that are yet to be born. William Beckford, Story of Prince Barkiarok. 1. The Black Tower. At the head of the winding river Ola'i, nearby the fragrant forest, stands the Black Tower of the Southlands. High into the air rise its bleak stone walls, piercing the sunset with splendor spire. For eternity it has been there, by the sluggish waters on which float great bloated crimson lilies, and for eternity will it be there. The peasants of the nearby village know not whence it came nor why 'tis there, and wisely avoid it when the moon is on the wane. Few dare visit the colorful forest of evil or the treacherous river, for strange and unholy things dwell therein. Some tell of how on the dark of the moon there comes from the great star Sirius a growing speck of flame ultimately losing itself in the eternal midnight of outer space. However this may be, it is certain strange and alien beings built this ebon tower in the dawn of the world, for purposes not understood by mortals, sealing the door long ages since. There is a tale the old wives spin, saying, one of the adventurous villagers, Castor by name, took undue interest in the tower, and was frequently seen slipping furtively to and from it in the dusk. Of all the people of the town he had the least savory ancestry, his father being a satyr, his mother a witch-woman. True, others mated with the people of the glen, yet it is not considered a thing to be proud of. The very burgomaster had a gnome none too far back in his lineage, which was expressed in the coarse features of his evil countenance. But a satyr! The righteous citizens avoided Castor scrupulously, and the dislike was mutual. So it was he continued on his silent trips unheeded. What he did there, so often, not known, but the seasons came and went, and the winter merged into spring, and in time it was Walpurgis Eve. That night the town gates were tightly closed and bolted, and all cowered behind locked doors. Strange shapes flew screeching through the air and sniffed most horribly at the doorsteps. That night Castor went to the tower as had become his habit, though his better sense warned him to stay home abed. His satyr ancestry openly rebelled, but the witch proved stronger. As he stole timorously through the wood, he heard sounds of high revelry from within the castle. Therefore, he was quiet as he hesitated before the foot of the long unopened door. Queer things were abroad, though he dared not return home alone through the forest. Still more did he fear to remain within reach of the things of the tower. As he deliberated on the course to take, the great door swung silently open, and a crab-like claw lovingly encircled his waist and drew him in. And he was seen no more by the villagers. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 2. The Shadow from Above. A midsummer day in the hamlet of Droom. The villagers went about their various tasks, and within the tiny market square the spice vendors and the people from the hills with their exotic burdens of gay fruits created a pleasant hum of busy occupation. Sleeping dogs lay contentedly in the warm sunlight, and the squat beasts of burden ambled about peacefully upon their 6 clawless paws, their grotesque faces slit with toad-like grins. All was, no one could have denied, entirely calm. Then one of the dogs lying in a doorway sprang suddenly and omitted a sharp bark. At the same moment a dark cloud apparently obscured the sun. In a short time it had passed unnoticed save for the dog, but his owner, an old crone in a voluminous black hood, peered intently at the clear and vacant sky, and started chattering in an excited tone. Soon the whole population was out of doors looking upwards at that which could not be seen, yet which cast a deep shadow. Nothing was to be perceived in the expanse of blue, yet upon the square cobblestones of the quaint little village an irregular black form wavered back and forth. Then it grew larger. Whatever it may have been, it was settling. The people drew back affrighted. Slowly the swinging motion ceased, and the thing drew near. A deep, heavy panting was distinctly audible, much like that of a great beast, and with a dull impact as though it was of a great weight, it alighted upon a grassy plot before the Chancellor's house. For a long time it lay there resting, and still nothing could be seen save the indentation of the grass, nor aught heard but the heavy breathing. Then, to the terror of the white-faced and nervous citizens, it rose on giant feet and tramped down a lane. Thud, 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 thud. The sound grew monotonous in its deliberation. Before its path lay a sleeping hound. It was lifted, as if in a vast claw, and vanished among horrid, rending sounds. A single drop of blood flecked the earth. Its taste momentarily sated, the thing paused and turned. It took some moments for reason to replace the stark terror of the townsfolk. Then there was a mad and frantic rush for the nearest houses. Those to first gain entrance barred the doors upon their comrades. In a moment the street was apparently bare, save for the unseen monster. All that afternoon and night it pried at doors, scratched at roofs, muzzled windows, and upset fruit carts inquiringly. But the people of Droom had built well. It did not gain entrance during the night, although few slept when they heard the constant breathing before their homes and the dull thumping sounds as it wreaked its malice upon the shops of the marketplace. It was high noon before any dared unbar their doors and venture forth. Nothing unusual greeted their blanched faces, and silently, apprehensively, they stole to their tasks. Soon all activity again commenced. The horror had gone. End of section 11. Section 12 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. The Flagon of Beauty. The princess drooped her long eyelashes. She was really quite pretty when she did this. "And you have brought it?" she asked softly, her hand stealing into his. He coughed. This being spokesman was a delicate task. "Yes, your highness," said the man. "It is here." He touched a small parcel beside him on the divan. "And you will give it to me?" she breathed. Steeling himself, he replied, "Their terms are the freedom of the people." She sprang to her feet. "Never!" "Not for the Flagon?" he queried harshly. "Not even for that." Reconsidering, she spoke slowly. 5 years ago, I sent a band in search of this fabulous drug into the low-lying jungle that cloaks the ancient cities. The cities that no man knows who built, there in the steaming swamps. Men have said that I was beautiful, yet, ironically, he for whom I have wrecked my empire scorned me. It was then I bethought me of this flask, made in the immemorial years agone, which figured in legend as containing the essence of beauty. Perhaps, I thought, with this I might win him from my rival. Today you have returned. Successfully, I grant you, and demand yield of my power for that which I desire. I have been told bitter things, that I have ruled mercilessly and tyrannically. That I have, but I cared little for affairs of state since I became enamored of my prince. He has neglected no indignity to impose upon me, but I cannot forget him. On the night of my feast of peacocks, he sneered at the priceless dishes and fed his monkey from the place. The gutter rat he has an infatuation for entertains him most skillfully, but he shares her with the soldiers. He prefers her florid charms to me. This I do not understand, but I command you, give me that flagon." He slowly shook his head. "No, Majesty, I cannot betray their faith. Fever took many lives in those crumbling ruins." "I warn you, I am desperate," she said imperiously. "Give, or I shall take." He lowered his gaze and remained silent. Seeing he was adamant, she made a gesture with her head, and a slave stepped from the curtained alcove. "Take this man to the room of pain," she ordered. In consternation, he sought to dash the frail vessel to the tiles, but it was dexterously twisted from his grasp by the blackamoor. The princess laughed insanely. "My men did well to steal you from under his nose, my wench," she sneered to the helpless woman at her feet. "Let me see those carmine lips smile at this," she added contemptuously, breaking the ancient seal covered with writhing none could interpret. "You are startled? Yes, it is the flagon. Watch if you wish, for you may not see when I am finished with you." She drained the very dregs, and flung the stopper in her captive's face. For a long moment there was no change apparent in her flushed countenance. Then she noticeably paled. Her hair swiftly grew leaded and gray, her lips assumed a ghastly pallor, and a score of tiny wrinkles appeared on her smooth skin. She became an old hag, quite out of place in the splendor of the throne room. End of section 12. Section 13 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 4. The Sacred Bird. There appeared one day in the marketplace of Ulathea a most peculiar fowl which fell exhausted from the skies. Its plumage was of brilliant hue, and despite its confusion, a wise and knowing look was seen within the orange eyes. After resting a moment, it fluttered about the square, entering the various shops in a proprietary manner, and finally settled in that of a sweetmeat dealer. Soon all the tradesfolk hurried across the cobblestones to see this gaudy visitor, and to feed it many tidbits. Not in the least bothered by its admiring audience, it permitted its head to be scratched and petted as it ate. In time, the news spread through the thatched houses to the ears of the Imperial Council, all of which laid down their pens and came in a body to view it. It was discovered by them greedily eating a preserved orange rind, a meal varied by occasional pecks at a nut. Having already devoured odds and ends of all sorts, it was no longer hungry, and even as they panted in, it fell asleep. When the crowd drew aside to admire the rotund council, it complained loudly. "Gwarn off and chase yourself," commanded the half-awake bird. "Gwarn off," it repeated, fluttering its wings and adjusting for a nice nap. It then uttered a rasping incoherency and dozed off placidly. The people drew back whispering excitedly. "A demon," averred one. This brought a chorus of dissension among the others. "An angel, just a trick. Who ever heard of a bird talking? A magician in disguise. What has happened? Still thy tongue, neighbor." The head of the council, a gray beard notoriously superstitious, cleared his throat and a silence fell over all present.
"My friends," he gurgled happily, "my dear friends and fellow citizens, this is an occasion of undoubted significance in the annals of our fair city, equaled only by that of, as you doubtless will realize, early in the reign of... Rather, to continue, in other words, my dear friends," he began over, unable to sustain the sentence any longer, "to make it clear to all concerned, this is, I believe, and no one, I hope, would contradict me, I have occasion to think."
Here his voice lowered to a whisper and ended in a triumphant shout.
"A messenger sent to guide us."
He leered cheerfully at the mob.
"Therefore let us convey it in the state to the city hall to rule us as it sees fit."
Which was forthwith done amid much celebration, and the chattering of the escaped parrot from that day guided the fortunes of the city of Aletheia, interpreted by the ruler and his council as they desired. End of section 13. Section 14 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 5. The Tomb of the God. For 4 days the band of explorers from Fur had been excavating the ancient and immemorial tomb of Crane on the edge of the desert. The sands had been blowing ceaselessly, even as they had done since before the coming of man to that far land. The tomb was built long before any human walked the face of the world, built by evil powers that had reigned unchecked in that unthinkably ancient day, when all the desert had been a verdant garden through which stalked great yellow giants of small intelligence, but of prodigious strength, that had built the tower and the city of the ancient and most powerful Lord Crane. And even before that, Crane had been. He had been for eons, and in turn had come from a strange planet. It was told in tradition and runes inscribed in a dead language, and ruled and malefically twisted the futures of worlds. But the time came that none had foreseen, and Crane, the ancient, fell into a semblance of death, though his flesh rotted not, nor did his aspect change. So the people of the earth gathered together and conveyed him in a giant funeral procession to the enormous tomb carven from living blue stone in the side of the mountain. And they sealed him in, and forever departed from his company. And the years and the decades and the centuries and the eons unthinkable came and went, and the sands swirled over the mouth of the tomb, and the door was obliterated, and none knew where Crane the elder god lay in stupendous slumber. Then audacious mortals had unwittingly found traces of this mausoleum that even legend had discredited, and they had resolved to open it, and seek the great body of the old thing that had laid unmoving since the world was young and green, lain while the prolific vegetation died, and the sand crept upon the land and laid it into barrenness. It was said that there had been sealed up in Crane's tomb treasures that made avarice pale, and gems the like of which no longer existed, jewels from far worlds of the dawn of time, worlds that had died and returned again. And the strange manuscripts with the Sothian chants upon them, and other equally desirable objects. Therefore many had set out to reach the far site of the old tomb, but few had reached it. Some had perished, slain by the hateful green devil things that lay beneath the surface of the sand in wait for unwary persons, and that sprang up to drag their victims to a horrible death. Some reached their goal and scratched and chipped the tight-sealed entrance, but it was as the gnawing of rats, and before they could do more, they had mysteriously vanished from human ken, nor had they ever been heard of afterward. Yet this did not discourage others from emulating, for the desire for power will lead men far, and power there was in the tomb. So again men were engaged in laboriously chipping away the obstruction, and making slight headway, when one of their members chanced upon an orifice in the rock into which he thrust his arm curiously. Beyond he touched something, and lo, the great door grated outwards, inexorably, ruthlessly, and ground him horribly into the stone sill, leaving naught save an unpleasant smear of brown, and a dank smell came forth, and the door was opened. Paralyzed, the survivors did not act until it had swung firmly back into place, and was immovable save by a repetition of the catastrophe. So though they could spare him ill, The others forced one of their brown slave men from distant Leek to do this suicidal act, and he whimpered and would have not, but they discouraged this by subtle and hastily improved tortures, and he eventually complied. They stepped delicately over the smear and caught the door, placing an obstruction in the way so that it might stay open. And then they entered, the first living things in that place since their race had appeared. The air was foul with the odor of newly dried seabed, and the stench was unlike that of anything within their kin. All about the giant vault were great chunks of richly colored gems cut in curious facets, with cryptic inscriptions upon each. But the central object was the tomb of Lord Crane, where his great body reposed upon a slab of figured chalcedony. He was terrible to gaze upon, for even after the immense period, he still held semblance of the horrifying aspect that was traditionally assigned unto him. And the explorers that had entered gathered around him for a moment in awe, but they were distracted by the infinite wealth that lay carelessly about. They became slightly affected by it, into a type of madness, and with repulsive amour and fetishism, they stroked the jewels and clung unto them. But what happened then, none can tell, for their two fellows standing guard beyond the entrance heard a peculiar sound that seemed as a slither, then a scream. Then the door shut again, and although the obstructing block was not touched by them, it had moved. And Crane's tomb was again covered by the drifts. Nor even after that brief glimpse of infinite wealth did any man of Four venture near, for the Lord Crane had roused from his long sleep and feasted. End of section 14. Section 15 of the Fantasy Fan magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 6. The Flower God. Aphlar, the ruler of Zaxtel, sent a present unto his enemy, the neighboring King Lud. Now such an act was unlike Aphlar, and had not pleasant omens. For more than a decade they had waged bitter warfare, and therefore Lud was not a little surprised to see the crimson lotus on a field of argent displayed before his gates. The messengers came unguarded in their glittering robes, and when the portcullis was withdrawn, they ascended the steps before the throne and made obeisance. The guards of Lud would have fain drawn wary swords, but the king signaled withdrawal, that he might hearken unto the emissaries. Their gift was brought in by swarthy slave men. It proved a many-colored flower of alien aspect, whose aromatic perfumes spread languorously through the room. Aphlar had sent no message save to state cryptically that here was the ruler of the plants, the flower god, and Lud preferred not to ask the reason for this strange and lovely gift. So it was he made a long and eloquent speech of surpassing insincerity, claiming friendship between the countries, and when they had left, he set artisans constructing a daïs. When this had been done, the flower god was set upon it in a jewel-encrusted trough, where he might lift his eyes from affairs of state and gaze upon it. And it was admired by the entire court. Only Gra, the counselor, would have been unwilling to accept it, but he was not heeded. But the land soon found there was something amiss, for gossip spread throughout that a madness had come upon the king. He would lock himself in with the flower for days in succession, and be oddly exhilarated upon resuming his customary life. Whispers were that he was drugged or hypnotized by the strange plant, that he performed odd and ancient rites before it, rites that were not good, and were avoided by even necromancers. Truly, he had developed an abnormal passion for it, and there were obviously mysterious happenings afoot. In time, he was observed to make unwise decisions after he had been alone with the flower god, and he would pause in the midst of trite affairs and go over to it, lovingly strolling the tendrils, and closing his eyes as if listening. But there was nothing audible save the rustle of the vibrant petals. The country did not improve through these unusual activities. Affairs assumed a turbulent state. Lawlessness prevailed. After a time, the traitorous openly denounced Lud, and there were few who did not sympathize. Those bolder even went so far as to suggest that Aphlar, the adjacent ruler, rule in his stead. But the king seemed entirely apathetic regarding this or anything save the flower god and its unholy lure. Meanwhile, Aphlar waited, smiling. Had not the venerable Chancellor Gra chosen to intervene, the land would have fast gone to ruin. But he was wise and took heed of the ultra-sensual lure the blossom held for its ruler. Therefore he saw the futility of attempting to restrain or interfere in any ordinary manner, and consequently resolved upon action that would forever break the reign of the holy plant. In fine, he determined to destroy the Lord of Flowers. Having made his plans, the following day he noiselessly entered the throne room, with a long grim knife concealed beneath his scarlet robe. The king did not heed him, for he was enthralled beyond human affairs. But the plant sensed the presence of the intruder, and perhaps it half knew his purpose, for the fleshly leaves writhed animatedly, and the green spines stood erect. Yet it did not arouse the entranced supplicant, and the 100 little viper tongues could not ward off the blows of the blade that Gra wielded so judiciously. The swollen blossom was rent and gashed in numberless places before the Emperor became aware of it. It was too late then, for great yellow drops of sickening ichor slowly coursed down the drooping vines, and the bloom itself was purpling fast. Then it was the king staggered a moment and stared long at his chancellor in a dazed manner, and Gra was thankful, for the light of madness was dying out, even as the plant faded. The flower god was dead. End of section 15. Section 16 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 7. The Little Box. On the planet called Loth, in the 7th city, there lived a semi-savage known as Suth. He had been captured in his youth by the fearless raiders of Fargo, but popular demand later caused the release of all the beings that once formed an interesting collection of the larger animals. So it was that one might have had for a neighbor anything from one of the reddish parrot people from the faraway island of Hin to a pale blue octopus thing from the dried seabed of Inya. Suth, it is said to be stated, was neither, being merely one of the commonplace brown-tailed men from Leek. He was, as are most savages, very inquisitive, and one day after returning from the Ridnazat works, wherein were manufactured first-class ornaments to be worn in the nose, he espied a small black box in the window of a money-lender, a box whose curious carvings and tightly closed lid brought up many questions. When the dealer refused to open it for him, his curiosity was doubly whetted, so that he purchased it, after unavoidable delay and expected haggling, thereby parting with the earnings of a week. Returning home with his prize, he managed to slip past a street brawl and get inside his house, a 3-towered affair resembling an ill-fitted layer cake, each successive story being smaller than the one upon which it reposed. Bolting the door, he then tried to force the lid open, but it resented this move on his part and showed it by pinching his finger violently. This caused him to fling it against the wall. It came to the floor with a dull thud, and the top fell off after a moment's silence. A squeaky voice issued from the interior.
"Press the control marked A, and the machine will come to him no matter where it is. I am making 3 boxes similar to this, and hope that someone will gain some benefit, for I haven't. Anyone finding this is directed to press the control marked A, and the machine will come to him, no matter where it is. I am making 3... declared the little box. As Suth did not understand what was said, it is to be feared the directions were lost upon him. Yet some demon directed his finger to the control marked A. Perhaps it was because all the other buttons were hopelessly jammed into the wood. Nothing happened, and Suth disappointedly threw the box through the window, where it landed upon the head of a prominent citizen, causing that worthy unwanted irritation. And Suth forgot about the box and the fraudulent control marked A, not knowing that 10 million miles away the machine was battering ceaselessly at its bonds, striving to escape and answer the long-awaited call, which it never quite managed to do. But the Lyrians gathered round with frightened eyes to watch the reanimation of the god of the forefathers on that far continent, and offered up sacrifices in the form of decrepit inhabitants and those who would have had them doubt their deity. End of section 16. Section 17.
of the weird fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 8. The Fall of the Three Cities. Far to the south of Four and bordering upon Yondath extends the vast jungle land. The river Oulé enters it at several points, making travel by boat difficult between Flagon on the desert, its outlet in the unnamed land. Where the jungle ceases, it gives way abruptly to a vast and mighty plain. This open country is now desolate and entirely uninhabited. Nothing but the six-legged and grotesque monster things called rogai roam its interminable fields of waving grass. Yet once this lower southland was a populous and fertile plateau, from the swampy morasses of Yondath even unto the mountains and Zoth, where dwell the fungi masters. How it came to be so barren is told in antique myth, and when people hear the fate of the land beyond the jungle, they shudder and make prayers in the air with the small finger. This then is the tale of the fall of the cities of the plain, they that were called by men Nazim, Zo, and Parenthines. Nazim lies now a waste, nor is there any trace of Parenthines, but one can yet find ancient ruins of Zo, and the Vandals of time have not entirely effaced the elaborate carvings of amber which lie half buried in the concealing grass near where the vast pool was once constructed in the center of the city. The whole thing started when the magician Volnar refused to leave Parenthines. He had been a most successful and prosperous sorcerer until the deplorable case of the fishwife whose hair all fell out and took root in the ground before her house. This the people took to be an evil omen, and it was really quite difficult for them to break into his low, strange house after his refusal to depart. They were all disappointed he had gone. They did not know of the black tunnel beneath where he kept his magical supplies. So, after searching hopefully around the house, someone set it afire, and they made merry by the embers, diverting themselves lustily during the pale night while he fled, with only his vengeful thoughts for company. The curious manner of his attire, together with the black-edged mantle of crimson, caused him to resemble a great moth flapping across the wasteland between the cities. By the time the last flagon of wine lay untidily upon the paving before where his house once was, and while yet his pet Mondal moaned inconsolably about the ashes, for his persecutors had been unable to capture the highly edible pet, Volnar arrived at the gates of Zo. The brilliance had begun in the northern sky, and the three suns were nearly risen. Soon would the far mountains be illuminated in yellow light, and Zoth shine its metal towers like the armor of a weary knight sprawled upon the hills. The black stone of the precipice directly under the fasthold served only to set it off. Soon, too, would the rich rice fields of cultivated vegetation gleam pleasingly, and the jungle come to animated life. But not yet were the gates open, for it had been the rule in Zo to keep fast closed till full dawn, ever since the night of the monster and neighboring Droom, close unto the mountains. There was a smell of spice hanging in the air, for the breeze was small, but this loveliness was wholly wasted upon the angry little sorcerer as he chafed before the giant gate. His robe was bedraggled from the mud, and he was wearied of no sleep. "Ho, guard!" he shouted irritably. "Can you not let an honest traveler within your cursed village before high noon?" This was on the whole a misrepresentation, for his traveling was unintentional, and he was by no means honest, but he did not consider the moral aspect of the matter. After a time, sounds of distant shuffling reached his ears, and after prodigious squeakings and bangings, a sleepy-faced man gave him entrance. Volnar entered the handsome city and made his way along the vast paving stones of yellow and brown, and at length arrived at a lodging-house, the lighted lantern yet glimmering in the shadow of the sleeping town. For a long time none saw the bearded little sorcerer upon the streets of Zo. He purchased an old house with curious artificial gold of his own contriving, a secret of wizardry he held to be pleasingly unique, and busied himself most industriously in the dank, ill-lit cellar. Twice he ventured forth, after nightfall, to obtain certain odd ingredients from a man to whom he was known, and the man, who had no ears but patches of fur that he concealed beneath his headgear, saw what was up and left the city straightway. Volnar worked on with his charms and spells, occasionally sighing for his abandoned Mondal, and frequently pondering upon his revenge. He pottered amidst his instruments, The thin cold light streaming through a crack in the rocky ceiling was aided by that of the small fire beneath the pot of bulging iron. Yet though even with these the gloom was little dispelled, Volnar did not care, for his eyes were familiar with darkness, in which his long apprenticeship had been spent. That students of the dark lore were not appreciated had become increasingly clear to him, ever since the night of his departure from Paranthines. Consequent discretion called for subterranean quarters. These he had obtained, and thus did he work upon the doom for Paranthines. And before he had completed the strange substance that bubbled so obscenely, and which cast off the odor of fresh blood mingled with some nauseating aroma, Volnar sent a messenger for Saral, the Lord of Worms, to obtain a certain ingredient most accessible to maggots. Frequently did he consult the parchments that were said to have been copied from the Sothian manuscripts by a slave of the Lord Crane very long ago, and elaborate care was exercised upon the concoction. Then at last it was completed, and Volnar gazed speculatively about the cellar, thinking for some time. He arose from his lengthy vigil and poured the contents of the pot into a cylinder of unglazed pottery, deftly sealing it with the enchanted gummy material of moist black. While the stuff was inside, it continued to seethe audibly, although it had been off the fire for some time. And this jar he bore with extreme caution as he turned the immense iron key in the cellar door. The sky was a starless void when he entered into the street, intent upon his mission. As he hurried through the silent city, accompanied only by his shadow, a successive lifting of vapor mists revealed the moon of ashen blue, but it was quickly obscured again. The air was chill and in ceaseless motion, faintly disturbing his crimson robe. His footsteps echoed hollowly upon the paving, and he felt that everyone must surely hear him, but he was not accosted. A lone pedestrian abroad for no good purpose emerged from the mist abruptly, but passed Volnar unseeing, and soon was lost in the fast-gathering dimness. It was very late now, and he was relieved when he approached the central part of the city with the cylinder beneath his arm, for it was increasingly heavy, and the contents unruly with new animation. Soon he reached the handsome marble pool that was the center of Zo, and the marvel of the three towns, but which is now but a faint indentation in the waving grass. The water was very still, and he let the thing in the urn slide noiselessly into the pool. It sank unhurryingly to the bottom, expanding, more solid now, and drifted away in the dimly hidden water. Whether it had moved of its own volition or was borne by a current, none but the inscrutable little man could have told. Volnar gazed after it, and apparently satisfied, departed. He did not return to his lodging, but made directly for the mountains upon a stolen rogai, which attained a remarkable speed for its bulk. And while the fate of the three cities moved slowly about the pool, the magician traveled ceaselessly toward Mount Boreal. After the man and his steed had approximated the nearer peaks, they stopped, and Volnar knew he was within safety. Therefore he watched searchingly the far dim mass that was the grouped cities. Nothing could be discerned, but the watcher knew evil forces were at work, forces none could halt or evade, save by direct flight, and who was to wake the sleeping towns? He chuckled grimly and hoped his pet Mondel was not within the doomed area. Then he made his way more slowly toward the crags of Boreal. During this while, the strange substance grew and distended in size and weight until it restlessly filled the large pool. It had assumed no definite shape, but life was unquestionably within the vast prehensile tissue that groped at the edge of its confines. It was as yet unable to release itself and venture in search of food, but the time was not distant. A chance pedestrian, with his moth-like cloak that was of the type common in those days, went slowly by and did not fully realize what was happening when he saw the thing droolingly emerge from the pool. The 100 evil eyes peered loathsomely as it extended an awful limb and seized him, intent upon the process of absorbing nutrition. Nor was that the end, for it roved the streets unsated, growing, devouring throughout the night, and in a few horrible hours had depopulated the cities that were so hostile to sorcerers. Volnar, it is told, went unto the black crags near Zoth, though discreetly distant from the inhabitants of that fearful place, and with occult aid constructed for himself a castle of black stone in a very short period, wherein he dwelt the remainder of his existence. This was not long, because of his ungrateful creation's abnormal longevity and appetite. End of section 17. Section 18 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Annals of the Jinns by R.H. Barlow. 9. The Mirror. Upon a certain day in the year of the Plague of Dragons, the Emperor of Yondoth held court in his ancient palace above the crypts. Many of his subjects had come from sheer curiosity, and when he cast sentence upon Calda, at least 2 of the more squeamish shuddered. For he had condemned the sorcerer Calda to the tortures of the green fungi, and of course everyone knew what it meant. Even if they had been obtuse or ignorant of the ways of the torturers in the subterranean rooms, the austere and saturnine look upon the face of his majesty would have implied much that was not pleasant. But Calda, the only pupil of the wise one Volnar, stood scornfully before the throne and gave no sign of terror, although his doom was a fabled and terrible one. He even contrived an ironic obeisance before they took him away. The 2 ugly slaves that held him exchanged significant looks as they silently led him out of the gorgeously hung room. Then those who had gathered began to depart, and many resolved not to anger their ruler after that. Calda's crime, it had been proclaimed, was that of high sacrilege. Not only had he sought through ancient and unwholesome magic the creation of artificial life, but he had spat upon the greenstone feet of the great idol in the marketplace, and asserted that the deity was impotent, and its priests humbug. Perhaps this iconoclastic behavior was regretted by Calda, since his destination was not pleasant to contemplate, but he gave no sign as the slaves led him through a series of connected chambers. Each of these dimly lit rooms was more ancient in appearance than the one preceding, and after he had traversed some dozen, the very bricks of the wall were so slimy with old moss that they emitted a noxious odor. Likewise the passages grew steadily darker. Legend told of the things that lay beneath the palace, and of the head torturer, Malyat, that had dwelt in his crypt for untold years without being seen by man. It was said that his face was obscured from even his victims by an ancient and grotesque mask. On this Calda reflected as the guards paused to light their tapers at a sconce tipped by a pool of sulphurous flame that seethed and boiled endlessly. He wondered at this, for no tracks disturbed the settled dust, yet the torch was as if newly kindled. Guided now by this melancholy light, they descended again, the torch but little dispelling the gloom. In this manner they made their way toward the lower chambers. Calda wondered at the labor that must have gone into chiseling these chambers from the rock, and at the ponderous, ornamental masonry that remained yet immovable after so long a time. At length they came to an ultimate passage fronting a huge door of iron curiously decorated and covered with the patina of eons. This appeared most formidable to the prisoner. It was upon this ancient portal that the guards smote with their clanging brazen swords, and then retired, leaving Calda alone. He wondered what evil thing would appear as he saw the door slowly opening. Then, in a terrible silence that his shrieks did not wholly dispel, a metal projection not unlike a tentacle rhythmically emerged, swayed a moment, and wrapped itself about him, and he was drawn into the chamber of Malyat. 4 cycles of the crimson moon elapsed before rumors found their way to the ears of the Emperor. A tale was told of the last creation of the sorcerer, a masterpiece of malign sorcery that had escaped destruction by the zealots of the greenstone god. It was said that all the work of Calda was evil, but that this last creation was supreme. Even unto his last days he had labored and expended his talents upon a certain mirror of strange design. No man knew the purpose for which it was shapen, but it was certain that Calda had not constructed it for the dubious vanity of reflecting his withered visage. The polished glass in it had come from the subterranean artisans of Salday, and it was polished and silvered by devious means. And the frame was of ebony strangely wrought with a monstrous carving. Great skill had gone into this, yet none knew its precise whereabouts, and the tales could find no definite origin. So the Emperor had scrolls lettered in the hieroglyphs of the land, and these were posted about the capital and all the outlying provinces. And they said that any man that could produce this mirror would have a reward bestowed upon him. At first there came many with false claims, but a supplementary proclamation was issued to the effect that impostors would be painfully disposed of, and thereafter the ruler was little annoyed. But in time there came an ancient one, unbelievably filthy, and clad in garments of odorous antiquity. His face was hideously wrinkled, yet it held a certain inscrutable wisdom. This repulsive being came unto the palace gates and demanded entrance, and the guards at first laughed, and then grew angry, and would have run him through with their long lances, had not the emperor intervened and called upon his men to desist, for he had heard the commotion and became curious. Thus admittance was granted to the beggarly person, and he entered as if he had expected this from the start. In dignity he went and bowed before the throne, strangely incongruous amid the richly clad servants that shrank from him in repugnance. The emperor's dwarf sought to make mock of the foul being, and rolled completely off his cushion in gales of false amusement, but he saw the eyes of the stranger, and straightway climbed back, mumbling in a surly tone to himself. The emperor bade him state his mission, and the old one spoke in a manner remarkable for one so uncouth, saying, "I have brought the object you desire." With great interest the emperor bade him display it, but the old one refused, stating in tones of certainty that he wished to make a few observations first.
"I might press my claim," observed the emperor, somewhat amused by this effrontery.
"I believe I have likewise the right of naming my price," suggested the old man.
"Truly," assented his majesty. "But first tell me, what is this mirror?"
"It is the mirror of truth," was the reply.
"A pretty allegory," remarked the monarch, and settled back.
So it was, the unclean person spoke freely in the court of the ruler.
"You will recall that this mirror was constructed by a certain sorcerer," he began in an unpleasant tone. "And you will also recall that this sorcerer did you a great service once. Did he not, Majesty?"
The emperor looked startled, and then very grave.
"He did. But how came you to know of this?"
"I shall elucidate when the time is come. Likewise did you promise certain things to this sorcerer in return for his labors."
The emperor's eyes smoldered with secret fury, but he said nothing.
"This you ignored, and some moons agone had the wonder-worker, I believe he was referred to as a blasphemer in the sentencing, this man you had brought before you and sent to the terrible tortures of Maliat. Am I not correct?"
"That is common knowledge," asserted the ruler uneasily.
"And he was taken to his doom?"
"My slaves seldom fail me."
"I am grateful to your majesty, for truth was essential. I have the mirror here," said the old one abruptly.
"What wish you in return?"
"It is yours. My payment will be given me in due time."
And as the emperor leaned forward, the man announced his identity and drew back his tattered robe, revealing the horror that lay beneath. Then, as the emperor gazed in fascinated repulsion, Calda drew forth the mirror with its strangely shapen handle and held it up that all might see. And when the ruler looked therein, no man may know what was reflected, for a strange and terrible thing occurred. Some dire magic was at work, for the doom that came into his majesty was alien to all accepted lines of death. End of section 18. Section 19 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. A Sad Story of the Future by Forrest J. Ackerman. Following is a brief summary of a recent radio broadcast taken from the story We Buy Us a Robot and What Happened in the American Weekly. A married couple had an 8-year-old robot and decided that it was about time to get a new one, as Willie was becoming worn and creaky and inefficient. So they went to look over the newest models. They selected Julius, a most capable Iron Man who could not tell a lie. This proved a disadvantage, however, as upon entering their home he declared in his deep, hollow, mechanical voice,
"Dust. Much dust."
As the wife would grow lonely when her husband was away, she had a phonograph record made of him assuring her how much he loved her. This she inserted into Julius and listened to him. But this made Julius become very pensive and sad. One day he was found reading love poems and crying. Julius was in love. He realized the hopelessness of the situation. One day he was found missing.
"Oh, he's committed suicide," the wife cried. "I know it."
"But that's impossible," her husband assured her. "If he tries to drown himself, he will only be short-circuited and rusted, and could be revitalized and polished up just like new. If he shoots himself, but a few parts need to be replaced. Jumping from a window would merely dent him a little. He cannot hang himself. He cannot poison himself. He cannot die by fire. Anyhow, our contract guarantees us against loss by suicide. Just then the televisor flashed on. It was an upstairs neighbor.
"My son's all dirty and greasy," he bellowed, "and it's your fault."
Our fault? How so? They asked. He gave a serial number.
"That's your robot, isn't it? Well, he went out into the park and called a lot of kids around him, told them he wasn't feeling well, gave them screwdrivers, and asked to find out what was the matter with him. In a few minutes, he was scattered all over 6 blocks. Julius, the mechanical man, had taken the only method an automaton knew of committing suicide. End of section 19. Section 20 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. From Beyond by H.P. Lovecraft. Horrible beyond conception was the change which had taken place in my best friend Crawford Tillinghast. I had not seen him since that day 2 months and a half before, when he had told me toward what goal his physical and metaphysical researches were leading, when he had answered my awed and almost frightened remonstrances by driving me from his laboratory and his house in a burst of fanatical rage. I had known that he now remained mostly shut in the attic laboratory with that accursed electrical machine, eating little and excluding even the servants, but I had not thought that a brief period of 10 weeks could so alter and disfigure any human creature. It is not so pleasant to see a stout man suddenly grow thin, and it is even worse when the baggy skin becomes yellowed or grayed, the eyes sunken, circled, and uncannily glowing, the forehead veined and corrugated, and the hands tremulous and twitching. And if added to this there be a repellent unkemptness, a wild disorder of dress, a bushiness of dark hair white at the roots, and an unchecked growth of white beard on a face once clean-shaven, the cumulative effect is quite shocking. But such was the aspect of Crawford Tillinghast on the night his half-coherent message brought me to his door after my weeks of exile. Such was the spectre that trembled as it admitted me, candle in hand, and glanced furtively over its shoulder, as if fearful of unseen things in the ancient lonely house set back from benevolent street. That Crawford Tillinghast should ever have studied science and philosophy was a mistake. These things should be left to the frigid and impersonal investigator, for they offer 2 equally tragic alternatives to the man of feeling and action: despair if he fail in his quest, and terrors unutterable and unimaginable if he succeed. Tillinghast had once been the prey of failure, solitary and melancholy, but now I knew with nauseating fears of my own that he was the prey of success. I had indeed warned him 10 weeks before, when he burst forth with his tale of what he felt himself about to discover. He had been flushed and excited then, talking in a high and unnatural, though always pedantic, voice.
"What do we know," he had said, "of the world and the universe about us? Our means of receiving impressions are absurdly few, and our notions of surrounding objects infinitely narrow. We see things only as we are constructed to see them, and can gain no idea of their absolute nature. With 5 feeble senses, we pretend to comprehend the boundlessly complex cosmos, yet other beings with a wider, stronger, or different range of senses might not only see very differently the things we see, but might see and study whole worlds of matter, energy, and life which lie close at hand, yet can never be detected with the senses we have. I have always believed that such strange, inaccessible worlds exist at our very elbows, and now I believe I have found a way to break down the barriers. I am not joking. Within 24 hours, that machine near the table would generate waves acting on unrecognized sense organs that exist in us as atrophied or rudimentary vestiges. Those waves will open up to us many vistas unknown to man, and several unknown to anything we consider organic life. We shall see that at which dogs howl in the dark, and that at which cats prick up their ears after midnight. We shall see these things, and other things which no breathing creature has yet seen. We shall overleap time, space, and dimensions. and without bodily motion peer to the bottom of creation."
When Tillinghast said these things, I remonstrated, for I knew him well enough to be frightened rather than amused. But he was a fanatic, and drove me from the house. Now he was no less a fanatic, but his desire to speak had conquered his resentment, and he had written me imperatively in a hand I could scarcely recognize. As I entered the abode of the friend so suddenly metamorphosed to a shivering gargoyle, I became infected with the terror which seemed stalking in all the shadows. The words and beliefs expressed 10 weeks before seemed bodied forth in the darkness beyond the small circle of candlelight, and I sickened at the hollow, altered voice of my host. I wished the servants were about, and did not like it when he said they had all left 3 days previously. It seemed strange that old Gregory, at least, should desert his master without telling as tried a friend as I. It was he who had given me all the information I had of Tillinghast after I was repulsed in rage. Yet I soon subordinated all my fears to my growing curiosity and fascination. Just what Crawford Tillinghast now wished of me I could only guess, but that he had some stupendous secret or discovery to impart I could not doubt. Before I'd protested at his unnatural pryings into the unthinkable. Now that he had evidently succeeded to some degree, I almost shared his spirit, terrible though the cost of victory appeared. Up through the dark emptiness of the house I followed the bobbing candle in the hand of the shaking parody of man. The electricity seemed to be turned off, and when I asked my guide, he said it was for a definite reason.
"It would be too much. I would not dare," he continued to mutter.
I especially noted his new habit of muttering, for it was not like him to talk to himself. We entered the laboratory in the attic, and I observed that detestable electric machine glowing with a sickly, sinister violet luminosity. It was connected with a powerful chemical battery, but seemed to be receiving no current, for I recalled that in its experimental stage it had sputtered and purred when in action. In reply to my question, Tillinghast mumbled that this permanent glow was not electrical in any sense that I could understand. He now seated me near the machine so that it was on my right, and turned a switch somewhere below the crowning cluster of glass bulbs. The usual sputtering began, turned to a whine, and terminated in a drone so soft as to suggest a return to silence. Meanwhile the luminosity increased, waned again, then assumed a pale Aphlar color, or blend of colors, which I could neither place nor describe. Tillinghast had been watching me and noted my puzzled expression.
"Do you know what that is?"
he whispered.
"That is ultraviolet."
He chuckled oddly at my surprise.
"You thought ultraviolet was invisible, and so it is. But you can see that and many other invisible things now. Listen to me. The waves from that thing are waking 1,000 sleeping senses in us. Senses which we inherit from eons of evolution from the state of detached electrons to the state of organic humanity. I have seen truth, and I intend to show it to you. Do you wonder how it will seem? I will tell you."
Here Tillinghast seated himself directly opposite me, blowing out his candle and staring hideously into my eyes.
"Your existing sense organs, ears first, I think, will pick up many of the impressions, for they are closely connected with the dormant organs. Then there will be others. You haven't ever heard of the pineal gland? I laugh at the shallow endocrinologist, fellow dupe and fellow parvenu of the Freudian. That gland is the great sense organ of organs. I have found out. It is like sight in the end, and transmits visual pictures to the brain. If you are normal, that is the way you ought to get most of it. I mean, get most of the evidence from beyond."
I looked about the immense attic room with the sloping south wall, dimly lit by rays which the everyday eye cannot see. The far corners were all shadows, and the whole place took on a hazy unreality which obscured its nature and invited the imagination to symbolism and phantasm. During the interval that Tillinghast was silent, I fancied myself in some vast and incredible template of long-dead gods, some vague edifice of innumerable black stone columns reaching up from a floor of damp slabs to a cloudy height beyond the range of my vision. The picture was very vivid for a while, but gradually gave way to a more horrible conception. that of utter, absolute solitude and infinite, sightless, soundless space. There seemed to be a void and nothing more, and I felt a childish fear which prompted me to draw from my hip pocket the revolver I always carried after dark since the night I was held up in East Providence. Then, from the farthermost regions of remoteness, the sound softly glided into existence. It was infinitely faint, subtly vibrant, and unmistakably musical, but held a quality of surpassing wildness which made its impact feel like a delicate torture of my whole body. I felt sensations like those one feels when accidentally scratching ground glass. Simultaneously there developed something like a cold draught, which apparently swept past me from the direction of the distant sound. As I waited breathlessly, I perceived that both sound and wind were increasing, the effect being to give me an odd notion of myself as tied to a pair of rails in the path of a gigantic approaching locomotive. I began to speak to Tillinghast, and as I did so all the unusual impressions abruptly vanished. I saw only the man, the glowing machine, and the dim apartment. Tillinghast was grinning repulsively at the revolver which I had almost unconsciously drawn, but from his expression I was sure he had seen and heard as much as I, if not a great deal more. I whispered what I had experienced, and he bade me remain as quiet and receptive as possible.
"Don't move," he cautioned, "for in these rays we are able to be seen as well as to see. I told you the servants left, but I didn't tell you how. It was that thick-witted housekeeper. She turned on the lights downstairs after I had warned her not to, and the wires picked up sympathetic vibrations. It must have been frightful. I could hear the screams up here in spite of all I was seeing and hearing from another direction. And later it was rather awful to find those empty heaps of clothes around the house. Mrs. Updike's clothes were close to the front hall switch. That's how I know she did it. It got them all. But so long as we don't move, we're fairly safe. Remember, we're dealing with a hideous world in which we are practically helpless. Keep still."
The combined shock of the revelation and of the abrupt command gave me a kind of paralysis, and in my terror my mind again opened to the impressions coming from what Tillinghast called beyond. I was now in a vortex of sound and motion with confused pictures before my eyes. I saw the blurred outlines of the room, but from some point in space there seemed to be pouring a seething column of unrecognizable shapes or clouds, penetrating the solid roof at a point ahead and to the right of me. Then I glimpsed the temple-like effect again, but this time the pillars reached up into an aerial ocean of light, which sent down one blinding beam along the path of the cloudy column I had seen before. After that the scene was almost wholly kaleidoscopic, and in the jumble of sights, sounds, and unidentified sense impressions, I felt that I was about to dissolve or in some way lose the solid form. One definite flash I shall always remember. I seemed for an instant to behold a patch of strange night sky filled with shining, revolving spheres, and as it receded, I saw that the glowing suns formed a constellation or galaxy of settled shape, this shape being the distorted face of Crawford Tillinghast. At another time I felt huge animate things brushing past me, and occasionally walking or drifting through my supposedly solid body, and thought I saw Tillinghast look at them, as though his better-trained senses could catch them visually. I recalled what he had said of the pineal gland, and wondered what he saw with his preternatural eye. Suddenly I myself became possessed of a kind of augmented sight. Over and above the luminous and shadowy chaos arose a picture which, though vague, held the elements of consistency and permanence. It was indeed somewhat familiar, for the unusual part was superimposed upon the usual terrestrial scene, much as a cinema view may be thrown upon the painted curtain of a theater. I saw the attic laboratory, the electrical machine, and the unsightly form of Tillinghast opposite me. But of all the space unoccupied by familiar objects, not one particle was vacant. Indescribable shapes, both alive and otherwise, were mixed in disgusting disarray, and close to every known thing were whole worlds of alien, unknown entities. It likewise seemed that all the known things entered into the composition of other unknown things, and vice versa. Foremost among the living objects were inky jellyfish monstrosities, which flabbily quivered in harmony with the vibrations from the machine. They were present in loathsome profusion, and I saw to my horror that they overlapped. That they were semi-fluid and capable of passing through one another and through what we know as solids. These things were never still, but seemed ever floating about with some malignant purpose. Sometimes they appeared to devour one another, the attacker launching itself at its victim and instantaneously obliterating the latter from sight. Shudderingly, I felt that I knew what had obliterated the unfortunate servants, and could not exclude the things from my mind as I strove to observe other properties of the newly visible world that lies unseen around us. But Tillinghast had been watching me, and was speaking.
"You see them! You see them! You see the things that float and flop about you, and through you every moment of your life. You see the creatures that form what men call the pure air and the blue sky. Have I not succeeded in breaking down the barrier? Have I not shown you worlds that no other living men have seen?"
I heard his scream through the horrible chaos, and looked at the wild face thrust so offensively close to mine. His eyes were pits of flame, and they glared at me with what I now saw was overwhelming hatred. The machine droned detestably.
"You think those floundering things wiped out the servants? Fool, they are harmless. But the servants are gone, aren't they? You tried to stop me. You discouraged me when I needed every drop of encouragement I could get. You were afraid of the cosmic truth, you damned coward. But now I've got you. What swept up the servants? What made them scream so loud? Don't know, eh? You'll know soon enough. Look at me. Listen to what I say. Do you suppose there are really any such things as time and magnitude? Do you fancy there are such things as form or matter? I tell you, I have struck depths that your little brain can't picture. I have seen beyond the bounds of infinity and drawn down demons from the stars. I have harnessed the shadows that stride from the world to sow death and madness. Space belongs to me, do you hear? Things are hunting me now, the things that devour and dissolve, but I know how to elude them. It is you they will get as they got the servants. Stirring, dear sir, I told you it was dangerous to move. I have saved you so far by telling you to keep still. Saved you to see more sights and to listen to me. If you had moved, they would have been at you long ago. Don't worry, they won't hurt you. They didn't hurt the servants. It was the seeing that made the poor devils scream so. My pets are not pretty, for they come out of places where aesthetic standards are very different. Disintegration is quite painless, I assure you, but I want you to see them. I almost saw them, but I knew how to stop. You're not curious? I always knew you were no scientist. Trembling, eh? Trembling with anxiety to see the ultimate things I have discovered? Why don't you move, then? Tired? Well, don't worry, my friend, for they are coming. Look, curse you, look! It's just over your left shoulder!
What remains to be told is very brief. It may be familiar to you from the newspaper accounts. The police heard a shot in the old Tillinghast house and found us there. Tillinghast dead, and me unconscious. They arrested me because the revolver was in my hand, but released me in 3 hours after they found that it was apoplexy which had finished Tillinghast, and saw that my shot had been directed at the noxious machine, which now lay hopelessly shattered on the laboratory floor. I did not tell very much of what I had seen, for I feared the coroner would be skeptical, but from the evasive outline I did give, the doctor told me that I had undoubtedly been hypnotized by the vindictive and homicidal madman. I wish I could believe that doctor. It would help my shaky nerves if I could dismiss what I now have to think of the air and the sky about and above me. I never feel alone or comfortable, and a hideous sense of pursuit sometimes comes chillingly on me when I am weary. What prevents me from believing the doctor is this one simple fact, that the police never found the bodies of those servants whom they say Crawford Tillinghast murdered. End of section 20. Section 21. of the weird fiction of Fantasy Fan magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Rider by Night by David H. Keller. I asked one of the small boys playing around the schoolhouse, "Does Miss Bell Flowers teach here?" She did, and 2 minutes later I was in her classroom, our conversation being listened to with much interest by the 20-odd little boys and girls in the room. It seemed that she was expecting me, and that I could make the examination in 20 minutes after school was closed, so I decided to wait outside. It was a modern 8-room, consolidated country school, which seemed to be built miles from everywhere. On one side, an old Ford car, 3 buggies, and at least 15 saddle horses were parked. A few shabby shrubs shivered silently in the sallow sunshine of spring. Here and there remnants of building material told the story of the building's recent construction. Walking along, I turned the corner of the building and looked toward the west. What I saw made me walk away from the schoolhouse to a white-haired darky sitting on the ground propped against a wire fence. He seemed asleep, but when I came near him, he turned to me a weazened face, with 2 eyes circled with the arcus senilis of the aged. I asked him to have a cigarette and lit it for him, then sat down by his side. "Queer place for a schoolhouse, Uncle," I said.
"Worse than queer. Poor and hard on us."
"How come?"
"Quality folks put it here. What land was cheap. 'Pears like they didn't know about massa."
"Your master?"
"None but."
I looked over at the tombstone, just one stone, and at the back of it a cypress tree. 4 fence posts around the tree and the stone, and then were connected by a wire fence. The posts were newly placed, the wire made up of odds and ends tied together and nailed in place with every kind of nail imaginable. I handed the old man another cigarette and a silver dollar. "Tell me about it," I asked. It was a short story. The colonel had gone to war in 61, and a servant had gone with him. In 62, the Negro had brought his master back blind. Years later, he had died and was buried on the knoll, and a cypress was planted at the head of the grave. Now he was forgotten by all except the whitened slave. The land had been sold and a schoolhouse built on it. Today was the first day of school. The old man, afraid that the grave would be desecrated by the cheap white trash, had dug 4 holes, put in 4 posts, wired them, and was now sitting guard till school was out and the children gone.
"The colonel sure wouldn't like it. Going to bother him riding."
"Does he ride?" I asked.
"Bound to. That airman was almost born in saddle. He rid to the war and he rid back, blind though he war, and he rides ever since. He done told me, 'Sam, I'm bound to ride till Miss Bell Flowers marries me.' Course, he done gone to heaven years ago, but every night he rides on his white mare, and I done cover my head with the blanket when I was hear their hoofs go pounding up and down the road."
"He was going to marry Miss Bell Flowers?" I asked. It appeared so. They were engaged when he rode away, and when he came back blind, she was married to another. Every night he had the white mare saddled, and would gallop up and down the road in front of her house. He and the mare died the same day, and according to his will, the colonel and the colonel's horse were buried in the same grave. School was dismissed. The children piled into the old Ford, into the old buggies, on top of the saddle horses, 1, 2, and even 3 to the horse. The school teachers, young and old, 7 of them, left the building. It was time for my examination of Miss Bell Flowers. I threw the rest of my cigarettes to the old Negro. "You have fixed the colonel," I laughed. "With that fence around the grave, he cannot get the mare out for his ride tonight." He looked at me with puzzled eyes.
"Massa's gwine to ride. Just bound to ride till he marries Miss Bell. Come sundown, I's gwine to open the fence to let him and the mare out. Warm tonight, and I'll sleep here. Massa may need me."
After talking to Miss Flowers, I told her that I was rather doubtful of her obtaining the life insurance. After I listened to her lungs, I was sure that she was a bad risk. A history of 2 years in bed fighting tuberculosis made me hesitate. She looked strong and as pretty as a rose, but today at the end of school, she had fever. We talked it over outside the schoolhouse. We said goodbye twice. Somehow it was difficult to say goodbye and leave her. To gain time, I asked her about Sam. It seemed that Sam went insane when the colonel died. There was a long story about it. Eventually I said goodbye again at her front gate and promised to call that night and hear the story. There was a full moon that night. She was waiting for me on the gallery, dressed in a riding habit of the 60s when ladies rode a side saddle.
"My grandmother's," she explained laughingly. "Yes, you have guessed it, especially if Sam talked to you. In 1860, Belle Flowers, pride of western Kentucky, was engaged to the colonel. They rode together, each on a white horse. She wore the dress I have on. I thought it would make the story more real to you if I wore her dress tonight. The colonel went to war, and Sam went with him. My grandmother was fickle and married her cousin and other flowers, and when the colonel came back stone blind, it was too late. He swore that he would not ride past her house till she married him. Grandmother used to tell me what a sight it was to see him go galloping by on his white mare, and no one able to tell by the way he rode that he couldn't see. She died years before he did, but he kept riding on, just as though he didn't know she was dead. Then one night he and the white mare died, and that was the end of the colonel. Of course, Sam says he still rides.
He does indeed, but of course that is just his insanity.
Yes, just his insanity, Miss Flowers agreed. I talked to him today about the patchwork fence he built around the grave, but he explained that he would take a piece down to let his master out on the horse. In summer he sleeps up there. Says he never can tell when the colonel will want him. It all seems so real to him.
She laughed as though tense with suppressed excitement.
It is good to have you call on me tonight, she whispered. I hardly ever see anyone except Father, and he is moody. Don't want me to leave the house at night. Made me promise not to leave the gallery unless you went too.
He knows about me?
Oh, yes, everyone knows about the new doctor. Let's walk down to the gate. In full moonlight you can see the white of the colonel's tombstone.
Picking up the trail of her riding habit, she went before me, down to the gate, and opened it. She showed me a spot of white through the trees. I took her hand. It was cold.
Night riders, she said suddenly. 2 of them. Hear them come galloping down the road?
I heard nothing but a hoot owl in the bottoms. Then something lashed me across the face, striking me to the ground. When I stood up, I was alone. Running into the house, I found Mr. Flowers.
"You are hurt,"
he cried.
"Slashed across the face with a riding whip. But you should have stayed on the gallery. Belle ought to have known better than to wear that dress. I told her not to, but you know how headstrong those girls are."
"That is not getting her back. Get a lantern. We have got to find her."
"We will go through the fields. There's a shortcut. You light the lantern while I get a shawl for her. God, but it's cold and there's a black cloud over the moon."
I carried the shawl and almost had to run behind him as he carried the lantern over the hill. We came to the corner of the schoolhouse at last. Halfway to the tombstone, we stumbled over a body. It was Sam, still alive but gasping for breath.
"They done come back, Colonel and his lady. I's gwine home now, case the Colonel won't call for me no more."
Hand on wrist, I looked at the white face of the man holding the lantern.
"He is dead," I whispered.
"We have to find Belle,"
he cried and went toward the grave. Then we found her sleeping, one hand on the stone, at rest. Sitting on the ground, he held her in his arms, crying. I took the lantern and examined the clay earth outside the fence, hoof prints of 2 shod horses side by side.
"She ran up here to tease you, Doctor. It was too much for her heart. She slashed you across the face in play and then ran up here, thinking you would follow her. That explains everything, doesn't it, Doctor?"
"It should," I said gently, trying to unlock his arms from the lovely thing he held. "It should, but the Colonel will ride no more." End of section 21. Section 22 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Ebony and Ash, A Tale of 3 Wishes by Richard Eli Morse. The city lay stricken in those streets where once the carnival had passed to the sound of lute and hautboy. Now maskers of another sort held reign, grey pestilence and livid fever and black-hooded death. The houses, so short a time ago bedecked with sweet-scented garlands and precious stuffs, stood bleak and shuttered above the echoing streets. Inside the people crouched, with staring eyes and hands that trembled. No more did song or dance fantastic make bright their chambers. Prayer and fasting, rather, penance for their sins. Sackcloth and ashes, had the grey-robed friars thundered for many a year, and now were their warnings proved indeed. But there were those who, having made a jest of life, would mock even at death himself. In tall painted chambers they feasted, where peacocks stalked emerald and amethyst on marble floors, while the banished flute and hautboy murmured softly, and great candles guttered away into perfumed ruin. Wine and jewels in the white breasts of women against the pall of darkness outside. When the feast was ended, the guests departed each to his home, hiding his face in a cloak, nor looking to right or to left. But there were 3, greatly favored by fortune, who left the feast boldly and unafraid: Florian, Marius, and Leon, friends from childhood, scoffers who feared nothing of the dank and noisome streets. With lanterns of hammered brass in their hands and swords girded at waist, they set out, singing a love song, a sugared trifle more befitting to some pleached alley than to this seething night. They had gone but a short way before they came upon an aged crone who feebly leaned beside an empty pedestal. 1,000 years seemed lined within the wrinkles of her face, but her eyes were young. Bidding them stop, she cried that she, who ever loved bold youth, would grant to each one wish, if such he should choose to ask of her. Believing her mad, yet willing to humor the fancies of a disordered mind, they wished. Florian spoke first, and begged that all the wealth within the teeming world be his. Marius next bespoke the fairest of women for his love. Leon last, and hesitating, sought happiness to be his boon. Then, laughing, they passed on, and coming to the square, parted, each for his home. Florian went swiftly, for now the moon lay hidden from the earth and darkness rode upon the air. But soon he needs must stop. Some vast bulk stopped his pace. Holding his lantern high, its gleam came back 1,000-fold, from gold and silver and gems heaped high until they seemed to threaten heaven itself. Falling upon his knees, Florian bathed his hands and arms within this precious flood, and threw bright handfuls against the crouching night. But now there was within his grasp something which seemed to whisper of sinister import, and as the dancing rays fell clear upon it, he shrieked and threw it far away. A skull! With stricken face he fled, but as he ran, through every vein a swifter racer sped, while shuddering pain was in every member, and the lips of fever twisted in a jagged grin. Now the moon tore from her web of shadows, and drew strange patterns over rooftops and cobbled ways. Marius stopped short, beholding at an open window a face of beauty such as found in dreams only, and then but seldom. Leaping from the street, Marius grasped the sill. She made no outcry nor murmur even when he caught her in his arms and kissed her curving mouth. She smiled ever, while from between her lips there crawled a bloated worm, and pestilence laughed aloud. But Leon lay quiet and forever still in the great square, with 2 curs worrying at his feet. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Laughter of a Ghoul by Robert Bloch. Have you ever heard the laughter of a ghoul? Shrill and high, it rises and ululates with the cadence of a song from the pit. Hearing it brings the soul closer to strange terrors, and gives the listener vague glimpses into half-opened doorways through which no man should peer too closely. Once I heard that mocking laughter in the silence of the night, and since that evil-fated day the night has held neither silence nor surcease from the haunting memory of that mirth or madness. Ever it lurks and lingers in the shadows of my brain, till only through expression of my torment can I hope to maintain my sanity in a world made hideous by the nemesis of inescapable memory. In all the rude mass realms of nightmare, there is nothing equaling in foulness that grim and fearful monster known to legend as the Ghoul. Accursed is he, and accursed the land burdened by his presence. In such a land I dwelt, lord of an ancient remote line. Slithering secrets dwelt within the archaic avenues of the vast and somber forest near my manor in the hills. Secrets black and hideous, haunting and unspeakable, such as demonian presences mumbled nightly in the eon-dead abysses beyond the light of stars. Here in this forlorn realm of trickling tarns and baleful solitude, my newly wedded and beloved bride chanced one day to wander, as in rustic holiday. All unbeknowing, I spent the day in town, returning only as eventide drew near. But she, my beloved, did not return, even with the coming of darkness. Then it was that the frightened servants who met me at the gate babbled that which sent me racing off, torch in hand, into the depths of the dreamwood looming so loathsomely in the unholy luminance of the autumn moon. Shrieking and cursing I went on, gibbering threats to the skies, but more dreadful still was my silence when at last I reached the end of my quest. Do not ask me how or where I found her. She was not dead, but she would have been better so after what it had done. She never spoke after I found her, and I do not think that she knew me. I pray that she did not. I carried her back to the manor, and delivered her to the care of the servants. Then, with a score of retainers, I returned again to the forest to do that which must be done, and to eradicate certain discoveries whose very existence was an insult to sanity. There were bloated trees to cut down, and creepers to be torn from the depths of nameless graves. There were curious holes to be blocked with massive stones, and certain tracks and monstrous footprints over which the good curé must pronounce exorcism. There was another shrub-hidden cavern in the swamps, containing grisly but unmistakable evidences of tenancy. One such place I entered alone and performed a deed with the long sword my grandsire had wielded in the Orient. Then I collapsed, and was carried home upon a hastily improvised litter of birchen branches, to toss for many weeks thereafter in the delirious agony of mocking, cacodemoniacal memory. After that, I spent many days poring unceasingly over disquieting bits of ancient legendry concerning the forest and its ghastly presences, whilst awaiting the birth of my wife's child, for she, in a condition of unsensibility, precluding her removal from the manor, was about to become a mother. And so slowly passed the dreary months of waiting and expectancy, whilst over all hung the shadow of an impending dread. At last the day arrived when, as I brooded in my study poring over the chronicle of a woodsman who had heard the pipes of Pan, the midwife came and gently touched me on the shoulder. In faltering accents, she whispered that my wife was dead. I sat there dully for 5 endless minutes. Then, in a voice sepulchrally muted, I asked after my child. She led me silently into the room where dead mother and living infant lay. Yes, the child was alive. Still is alive. But I will say no more. May the ultimate powers consign it, and the fate that produced it, to everlasting torment. For it was when I entered that room where the dead mother and the living infant lay that I heard for the first time the laughter of a ghoul. End of section 23.
Section 24 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Sorcery of Aphlar by Duane W. Rimel and H.P. Lovecraft. The Council of 12 seated on the jeweled celestial days ordered that Aphlar be cast from the gates of Bel-Hazan. He sat too much alone, they decreed, and brooded when toil should have been his lot. And in his obscure and hidden delvings he read all too frequently those papyri of elder eons which reposed in the Gothic shrine, and were to be consulted only for rare and special purposes. The twilight city of Bel-Hazan had climbed backward in its knowledge. No longer did philosophers sit upon street corners speaking wise words to the populace, for stupid ignorance ruled within the crumbling and immemorially ancient walls. Where once the wisdom of the stars abounded, only feebleness and desolation now lay upon the place, spreading like a monstrous blight and sucking foul nurture from the stupid dwellers. And out of the waters of the Ol that meandered from the mountains of Azlaka to pass by the aged city, there rose often great clouds of pestilence that racked the people sorely, leaving them pale and near to dying. All this their loss of wisdom brought, and now the council had sent their last and greatest wise man from them. Aphlar wandered to the mountains far above the city, and built a cavern for protection from the summer heat and winter chill. There he read his scrolls in silence, and his mighty wisdom to the wind about the crags, and to the swallows on the wing. All day he sat and watched below or drew queer drawings on small bits of stone and chanted to them, for he knew that some day men would seek the cave and slay him. The cunning of the 12 did not mislead him. Had not the last exiled wise man's screams rent the night 2 moon rounds before when people thought him safely gone? Had not his own eyes seen the priest's sword-slashed form floating by in the poison waters? He knew no lion had killed old Azik. Let the council say what they might. Does a lion slash with a sword and leave his prey uneaten? Through many seasons Aphlar sat upon the mountain, gazing at the muddy Ol as it wound into the misty distance to the land where none ever ventured. He spoke his words of wisdom to the snails that worked in the ground by his feet. They seemed to understand,
and waved their slimy feelers before they sank beneath the sand again. On moonlight nights, he climbed the hill above his cave and made strange offerings to the moon god Alo, and when the night birds heard the sound, they drew close and listened to the whispering. And when queer winged things flapped across the darkened sky and loomed up dimly against the moon, Aphlar was content. Those which he had addressed had heeded his beckoning. His thoughts were always far away, and his prayers were offered to the pale fancies of dusk. Then one day, past noontide, Aphlar rose from his earthen chair and strode down the rock mountainside. His eyes, heeding not the rotten stone-walled city, held steadfastly to the river. When he drew near its muddy brink, he paused and looked up the bosom of the stream. A small object floated near the rushes, and this Aphlar rescued with tender and curious care. Then, wrapping the thing in the folds of his robe, he climbed up again to his cave in the hills. All day he sat and gazed upon the object, rummaging now and then in his musty chronicles, and muttering awful syllables as he drew faint figures on a piece of parchment. That night the gibbous moon rose high, but Aphlar did not climb above his dwelling. Queer night birds flew past the cavern's mouth, chirped eerily, and fled away into the shadows. Many days passed before the council sent their messengers of murder, but at last the time was thought ripe, and 7 dark-browed men stole away to the hills. Yet when that grim 7 ventured within the cave, they saw not the wise man Aphlar. Instead, small blades of grass were sprouting in his natural chair of earth. All about lay papyri, dim and musty, with faint figures drawn upon them. The 7 shuddered and left forthwith when they beheld these things, but as the last man tremblingly withdrew, he saw a round and unknown thing lying on the ground. He picked it up, and his fellows drew close in curiosity, but they saw upon it only alien symbols which they could not read, yet which made them shrink and quaver without knowing why. Then he who had found it cast it quickly over the steep precipice beside him, but no sound came from the slope below whereon it should have fallen, and the thrower trembled, fearing many things that are not known, but only whispered about. Then when he told how the sphere he had held was without the weight a thing of stone should have, how it was like to have floated on air as the thistledown floats, he and the 6 with him slunk as one from the spot, and swore it was a place accursed. But after they had gone, a snail crawled slowly from a sandy crevice, and slid intently over to where the blades of grass were growing. And when it reached the spot, 2 slimy feelers stretched forth, and bent oddly downward, as if eager to watch forever the winding river. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. The Slanting Shadow by August Derleth. Mr. Abner Follansby, investigator for the Society for Psychic Research, stopped his car to peer out into the Wisconsin woods. To his companion, he said, "This is apparently the place, Fred. There's a sign off to one side. Pretty well shot. Kroll's Inn. Let's see that young lady's letter again." Fred Tenney took a letter from his inner coat pocket and thrust it toward Follansby, who opened it and regarded the scrawled writing dubiously. "Probably just another wild goose chase," he said presently. "Looks to me more like a matter for the police. The girl's guardian, Uriah Kroll, disappeared over a year ago, and since then his room has been very strange. That's all it amounts to. I suppose the young lady thinks she's got a ghost on her hands." The younger man smiled. "Something about a shadow, isn't there?" "Yes, there's a queer shadow on the bed in his room when the moon shines," she writes. "I can't understand it. It should be there. That's all." "Very lucid," commented Tenney laconically. The inn itself was a quiet little house of stone, hugging the ground in the middle of a clearing not very far from the heavily wooded roadside. A flagstone walk led up to a low stone porch, where the key to the front door lay under the mat, just where Miss Harriet Sears had said it would be in her letter to Follansby. As he bent to unlock the door, Follansby said, "At least we can thank goodness we're alone. Miss Sears isn't likely to come busting in on us at all hours of the night. She vowed she'd never set foot inside the building until we'd settled that shadow business." He threw the door open on a short hallway leading directly into a low raftered sitting room, into which Follansby immediately strode, followed by his companion. The room was comfortably and well furnished with antique pieces. The chairs were curiously carved and obviously handmade. Follansby, however, wasted no time in the sitting room, but led the way into another smaller room, and around into a large bedroom in the southeast corner of the building. This was the room which had been occupied by Uriah Kroll prior to his disappearance, as described in Miss Sear's letter. It was a large, oddly furnished room, with a bed against the south wall, and a single chair next to it, the north wall of the room next door being occupied by what appeared to be a workbench. Follansby, having looked cursorily at the bed, went over to the bench and bent above it. Tenny came over and stood at his side. "What do you make of it?" Follansby asked. "Queer outfit," Tenny replied. "Looks as if he might have been blowing glass, doesn't it?" Follansby bent and took up a book. "Well, look at this," he said in surprise. "Arbitel's Treatise on Magic." "Yes," supplemented Tenny excitedly. "And see here, he's got a trident and incense and oils. Why, he's dabbled in magic." "No doubt of it," assented Follansby gravely. He put the book down and examined the instruments on the bench. He chuckled oddly to himself, held up a magical diagram made on a sheet of stiff paper, and smiled at it with Tenny. Then he turned away, looked once more about the room, and said, "If you brought the lunch kit, we'll eat. The sun'll go down in about 3/4 of an hour, and the moon'll be up shortly after. We might as well be ready." "What's the procedure?" "We sleep here. Nice, comfortable double bed, as far as I can see," replied Follansby. Lunch eaten, the two investigators returned to the bedroom where they were to sleep. The moon had already risen, so long had they sat in the kitchen, but it was not yet throwing its light through the single window to the south. Follansby and Tenny sat talking for the better part of an hour. It was the older man who first noticed that the moonlight had reached the counterpane of the bed. "There we are," he said. "Now for the shadow." They sat for a few minutes in silence while the light of the moon crept in a parallelogram across the counterpane. But there was no shadow save the shadow of a tree, a few branches of which dipped into the moonlight. Presently Follansby rose and went in some irritation over to the bed, and stood looking down at the patch of moonlight. "Batty as can be," he murmured, obviously referring to Miss Harriet Sears. Tenny, who had drifted to his side, said suddenly, "What a funny angle those branches have." Follansby bent abruptly closer. "As if they were coming from above," he murmured. "But look here, they're not just branches. They're like a forest of little trees, and what odd spines for leaves." Suddenly he whirled to the window. "Oh, now I see," he said harshly. "There's no tree of any kind beyond the window." "Nor anything to make that shadow," added Tenny. They stood for a few moments scrutinizing the glass and looking through it into the clearing outside. The line of trees to the south was too far for any shadow to reach the house. The trees were shadowed in an uneven light across the clearing below. Then they returned to the bed and stood looking down at the counterpane. "Well, there has to be some explanation," said Tenny. Follansby nodded. "But I don't get it," he said. Then he stopped abruptly, staring down at the parallelogram of moonlight widening eyes. Tenny followed the older man's startled gaze. There in the moonlight was a tiny moving shadow, a shadow only slightly over 2 inches in height, moving with incredible rapidity, yet achieving no distance in the parallelogram of moonlight, the figure of a man. Back and forth it ran within a space so small that it might have been covered by the extended palm of a hand. The two men stared in growing amazement. Then Follansby turned to the window again, but there was nothing there. Nothing on the glass, nothing against the glass outside, nothing flying against the moonlight in the sky. He turned back to the bed. The shadow was still there. He bent, peering intently. The incredible shadow was running wildly this way and that, its tiny arms outflung, its spindle legs moving rapidly upon the counterpane. A thing alive, yet without substance. "Good God," muttered Tenny at last. "It's a man. It's a live man, but where is he?" "I don't know," Follansby jerked out. He stood for a few moments more, his fascination for the unbelievable shadow holding him there. Then he swung away and went over to the workbench, where he lit a lamp and began to thumb swiftly through a group of the old books lying carelessly abandoned there. Tenny followed, asking, "Can I help?" The older man nodded. "Check up on all references to magical designs in these books," he said. "I've got an idea. I don't know what's in it, but it's worth trying." It was Follansby who found what they sought. "Here it is," he said suddenly. "Magical designs on glass. It's been marked up by someone, too. Kroll, most likely. Parts of it are illegible, but the sense of it can be made out. Third paragraph down in the second column." Tenny bent to read the printed lines on the yellow page. "Certain mages have brought into being worlds of glass. Invisible in glass, the objects of such consistency that though they cannot be seen in the light of the sun, they are shadowed by the moon. The glass is of no ordinary kind, but must be specially made, and the creatures to be placed there may be drawn from the mind or from life." "You see," cut in Follansby, drawing the book away. "That's what he was doing. But something happened. He tried it on himself and vanished." Tenny turned astonished eyes on the glass in the window. Follansby abruptly left the workbench and, going over to the window, raised it. "It's the upper pane we want," he murmured. "It must be broken. There's no other way, but be careful that all the pieces fall into the room." As he spoke, the older man pulled down the upper half of the window. Then he drew the curtain down outside the glass and into the room again below. "All right," he said. "Break it, Fred." Tenny rapped sharply against the glass of the upper pane. It did not break. He struck it harder with the trident from the workbench. Still it did not break. Then he smashed into it with all his strength. The glass broke into incredibly small fragments that slithered down the drawn curtain to the floor. Follansby let the curtain snap up. Looking down, he and Tenny exclaimed simultaneously. The window lay in silver fragments on the carpet in the moonlight that stretched to the bed. But beyond the fragments ran a tiny dark shadow, of substance now. "Good God," breathed Follansby hoarsely. "The dimensions didn't change." "It's Kroll," said Tenny. He swooped to seize hold of the figure on the carpet, but at that moment it disappeared under the bed. He sank to his knees. "Kroll!" he shouted. "Come out, Kroll!" There was a vague scuttering noise beneath the bed. Follansby came to his knees at Tenny's side and peered into the moonlit dusk beneath the bed. "Kroll," he whispered softly. Turning abruptly, he said to Tenny, "Get over on the other side. He's skirting the wall toward the door." Tenny moved to obey. Then suddenly there came a quick rustle. A dark shadow launched itself from the wall upon the 2-inch figure that crept toward the door. There was a shrill squeal, a tiny human scream, an abrupt, unnatural silence. "A rat," whispered Follansby shakily. "My God." He got up unsteadily and looked down at the bed. The moonlight lay unbroken on the counterpane. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Little Old Lady by P.J. Searles. Connors was genuinely puzzled. What had happened to the old lady? Surely she could not have fallen from the car. On the other hand, why should she have left before reaching her destination? And how could she have got out without his notice? Her disappearance was perplexing. He had first seen the old lady when he had stopped to admire the picturesque church on the outskirts of Huntsville. Wearing an old-fashioned, rather shabby taffeta dress, ornamented at the throat and wrists with bits of yellowed lace, a bonnet that proclaimed her adherence to the fashions of 1880, and with a sole jet pendant hanging from her neck, she was standing near the car as Connors came out of the church and strolled through the adjoining graveyard reading quaint inscriptions on the tombstones. Her manner was forlorn and pathetic as she edged timidly up to Connors to ask in a low voice if he were driving on to Milltown. When Connors replied in the affirmative, the old lady hesitantly mumbled that she had not seen her daughter in Milltown for 5 years, and could she ride into the city with him. Since the front seat was loaded with bundles, Connors had placed the old lady in the rear and driven on. Some 20 miles had been traversed and the outskirts of Milltown reached, when Connors discovered he was out of cigarettes. Stopping the car at a corner drugstore, he went in to buy his favorite brand. Once inside, he recalled the old lady's presence and, stepping out again, asked if she would like an ice cream soda. Her pleasure and gratitude seemed all out of proportion to the offer until she said she had not tasted ice cream for over 5 years. When they were ready to drive on again, Connors asked the old lady where she wanted to be taken. At first she was certain she could walk the rest of the way, but finally agreed with Connors' insistence that he could easily drive her to the daughter's home, which she had never visited. Number 17 Portland Street was the address she gave, an address that took Connors far out of his normal route, into an unfamiliar section of the city. After perhaps 15 minutes of driving, he reached Portland Street and stopped the car at a corner to inquire directions for number 17. The first person he asked pointed to a house 4 doors from the corner. It was at this moment that Connors turned around and discovered that the old lady was missing. Her disappearance was puzzling. It seemed unbelievable that she could have left the car without being noticed by Connors, or that she would have left without so much as a thank you, but the fact remained that she was gone. Connors jumped out of his seat, looked up and down the street, glanced behind the car, peered into the corner. There was no sight of the old lady. Connors was both perplexed and irritated. After a moment's indecision, he stepped across to number 17 and rang the bell. His summons was answered by a pleasant-looking young woman. "Pardon me," said Connors. "I'm afraid I don't know your name, but are you expecting your mother today?"
"My mother?" replied the woman with a gasp. Why, what do you mean?"
"A nice old lady in Huntsville this morning asked me to drive her to 17 Portland Street to visit her daughter, whom she hadn't seen for 5 years. I brought her into town, but when I stopped at the corner there to inquire the way, I found she was no longer in the car. So I came on here to ask if she had already arrived."
"What did she look like?"
"A sweet old lady, short and slender, snow-white hair, pale thin cheeks, wearing an old-fashioned taffeta dress with yellow lace and a jet necklace. Is that your mother?"
"Yes, that is my mother, but she died in Huntsville 5 years ago today."
End of section 26. Section 27 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Lost Excerpts by Robert Nelson. 1. In Living Darkness. In dreams agone, I walked aimlessly and long in far and distant realms. I have seen wretched and depressed women feed with their milk the famished spirits that swelter and moulder amid the rank noisomeness of charnel hells. By blue and rotting trees I have seen colossal and cankered white worms fawning to their young and devouring themselves. I have seen evil and demented dwarfs fleeing flaring torches into the face of maids who were playing sad violins and dying with nameless sins and melody. And I have stood on red rocks overlooking a black and ever-surging sea, wherein dread things stabbed and slew and shrieked in exaltation to the molten, dripping skies. End of section 27. Section 28 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Lost Excerpts by Robert Nelson. 2. The Feast of the Centaurs. The enormous chamber was aflare with a myriad lamps. There were long tables covered with seemingly endless varieties of meats, wines, cheeses, birds, and other viands and edibles. Drunken centaurs carried other intoxicated centaurs across the tables, trampling everything that came their way, causing both wrath and mirth to others. Wine was spilled heavily all about, and centaurs fell and grappled with one another on the lubricious earth. 2 there were who fought for the possession of a fried grasshopper, and 3 belabored each other's heads with weighty stools. Some threw great platters of food from the tables and demanded more wine, and the exaltation that arose from the food and creatures became heavier, and the rejoicing and the swearing and debating of tongues increased. There were huge mirrors of multiplied convexity in the vast room, and these seemed to enhance and sharpen the ebbing and flowing luminosity from the immense wax lights and bright vases. The mirrors caused much confusion among the inebriated and overgorged creatures, for they crashed and careened with one another against the mirrors and cut themselves, and laughed and cursed at their own grotesque and misshapen likenesses. End of section 28. Section 29 of the Weird Fiction of Fantasy Fan Magazine. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Beyond the Wall of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft. I have an exposition of sleep come upon me. Shakespeare. I have often wondered if the majority of mankind ever paused to reflect upon the occasionally titanic significance of dreams, and of the obscure world to which they belong, whilst the greater number of our nocturnal visions are perhaps no more than faint and fantastic reflections of our waking experiences, Freud to the contrary with his puerile symbolism. There are still a certain remainder whose immundane and ethereal character permits of no ordinary interpretation, and whose vaguely exciting and disquieting effect suggests possible minute glimpses into a sphere of mental existence no less important than physical life, yet separated from that life by an all but impassable barrier. From my experience I cannot doubt but that man, when lost to terrestrial consciousness, is indeed sojourning in another and uncorporeal life, of far different nature from the life we know, and of which only the slightest and most indistinct memories linger after waking. From those blurred and fragmentary memories we may infer much, yet prove little. We may guess that, in dreams, life, matter, and vitality, as the earth knows such things, are not necessarily constant, and that time and space do not exist as our waking selves comprehend them. Sometimes I believe that this less material life is our truer life, and that our vain presence on the terraqueous globe is itself the secondary or merely virtual phenomenon. It was from a youthful reverie filled with speculations of this sort that I arose one afternoon in the winter of 1900 and 1901, when to the state psychopathic institution in which I served as an intern was brought the man whose case has ever since haunted me so unceasingly. His name, as given on the records, was Joe Slater, or Slater, and his appearance was that of the typical denizen of the Catskill Mountain region, one of those strange repellent scions of a primitive colonial peasant stock, whose isolation for nearly 3 centuries in the hilly fastnesses of a little traveled countryside has caused them to sink to a kind of barbaric degeneracy, rather than advance with their more fortunately placed brethren of the thickly settled districts. Among these odd folk, who correspond exactly to the decadent element of white trash in the South, law and morals are non-existent, and their general mental status is probably below that of any other section of the Native American people. Joe Slater, who came to the institution in the vigilant custody of 4 state policemen, and who was described as a highly dangerous character, certainly presented no evidence of his perilous disposition when I first beheld him. Though well above the middle stature, and of somewhat brawny frame, he was given an absurd appearance of harmless stupidity by the pale, sleepy blueness of his small watery eyes, the scantiness of his neglected and never-shaven growth of yellow beard, and the listless drooping of his heavy nether lip. His age was unknown, since among his kind neither family records nor permanent family ties exist, but from the baldness of his head in front, and from the decayed condition of his teeth, the head surgeon wrote him down as a man of about 40. From the medical and court documents we learned all that could be gathered of his case. This man, a vagabond, hunter, and trapper, had always been strange in the eyes of his primitive associates. He had habitually slept at night beyond the ordinary time, and upon waking would often talk of unknown things in a manner so bizarre as to inspire fear even in the hearts of an unimaginative populace. Not that his form of language was at all unusual, for he never spoke save in the debased patois of his environment, but the tone and tenor of his utterances were of such mysterious wildness that none might listen without apprehension. He himself was generally as terrified and baffled as his auditors, and within an hour after awakening would forget all that he had said, or at least all that had caused him to say what he did, relapsing into a bovine, half-amiable normality like that of the other hill-dwellers. As Slater grew older, it appeared, his matutinal aberrations had gradually increased in frequency and violence, till about a month before his arrival at the institution had occurred the shocking tragedy which caused his arrest by the authorities. One day near noon, after a profound sleep begun in a whiskey debauch at about 5 of the previous afternoon, the man had roused himself most suddenly, with ululations so horrible and unearthly that they brought several neighbors to his cabin, a filthy sty where he dwelt with a family as indescribable as himself. Rushing out into the snow, he had flung his arms aloft and commenced a series of leaps directly upward in the air, the while shouting his determination to reach some big cabin with brightness in the roof and walls and floor and the loud queer music far away. As 2 men of moderate size sought to restrain him, he had struggled with maniacal force and fury, screaming of his desire and need to find and kill a certain thing that shines and shakes and laughs. At length, after temporarily felling one of his detainers with a sudden blow, he had flung himself upon the other in a demonic ecstasy of bloodthirstiness, shrieking fiendishly that he would jump high in the air and burn his way through anything that stopped him. Family and neighbors had now fled in a panic, and when the more courageous of them returned, Slater was gone, leaving behind an unrecognizable pulp-like thing that had been a living man but an hour before. None of the mountaineers had dared to pursue him, and it is likely that they would have welcomed his death from the cold. But when several mornings later they heard his screams from a distant ravine, they realized that he had somehow managed to survive, and that his removal in one way or another would be necessary. Then had followed an armed searching party, whose purpose, whatever it may have been originally, became that of a sheriff's posse after one of the seldom popular state troopers had by accident observed, then questioned, and finally joined the seekers. On the 3rd day, Slater was found unconscious in the hollow of a tree and taken to the nearest jail, where alienists from Albany examined him as soon as his senses returned. To them he told a simple story. He had, he said, gone to sleep one afternoon about sundown after drinking much liquor. He had awakened to find himself standing bloody-handed in the snow before his cabin, the mangled corpse of his neighbor Peter Slater at his feet. Horrified, he had taken to the woods in a vague effort to escape from the scene of what must have been his crime. Beyond these things he seemed to know nothing, nor could the expert questioning of his interrogators bring out a single additional fact. That night Slater slept quietly, and the next morning he wakened with no singular feature, save a certain alteration of expression. Dr. Bernard, who had been watching the patient, thought he noticed in the pale blue eyes a certain gleam of peculiar quality, and in the flaccid lips an all but imperceptible tightening, as if of intelligent determination. But when questioned, Slater relapsed into the habitual vacancy of the mountaineer, and only reiterated what he had said on the preceding day. On the 3rd morning occurred the first of the man's mental attacks. After some show of uneasiness and sleep, he burst forth into a frenzy so powerful that the combined efforts of 4 men were needed to bind him in a straitjacket. The alienists listened with keen attention to his words, since their curiosity had been aroused to a high pitch by the suggestive, yet mostly conflicting and incoherent stories of his family and neighbors. Slater raved for upwards of 15 minutes, babbling in his backwoods dialect of green edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music, and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all did he dwell upon some mysterious blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he said, he would soar through abysses of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in his way. Thus ran his discourse, until with the greatest suddenness he ceased. The fire of madness died from his eyes, and in dull wonder he looked at his questioners and asked why he was bound. Dr. Bernard unbuckled the leather harness and did not restore it till night, when he succeeded in persuading Slater to don it of his own volition, for his own good. The man had now admitted that he sometimes talked queerly, though he knew not why. Within a week 2 more attacks appeared, but from them the doctors learned little. On the source of Slater's visions they speculated at length, for since he could neither read nor write, and had apparently never heard a legend or fairy tale, his gorgeous imagery was quite inexplicable. That it could not come from any known myth or romance was made especially clear by the fact that the unfortunate lunatic expressed himself only in his most simple manner. He raved of things he did not understand and could not interpret, things which he claimed to have experienced, but which he could not have learned through any normal or connected narration. The alienists soon agreed that abnormal dreams were the foundation of the trouble, dreams whose vividness could for a time completely dominate the waking mind of this basically inferior man. With due formality, Slater was tried for murder, acquitted on the ground of insanity, and committed to the institution wherein I held so humble a post. I have said that I am a constant speculator concerning dream life, and from this you may judge of the eagerness with which I applied myself to the study of the new patient as soon as I had fully ascertained the facts of his case. He seemed to sense a certain friendliness in me, born no doubt of the interest I could not conceal, and the gentle manner in which I questioned him. Not that he ever recognized me during his attacks, when I hung breathlessly upon his chaotic but cosmic word pictures, but he knew me in his quiet hours, when he would sit by his barred window weaving baskets of straw and willow, and perhaps pining for the mountain freedom he could never again enjoy. His family never called to see him. Probably it had found another temporary head, after the manner of decadent mountain folk. By degrees I commenced to feel an overwhelming wonder at the mad and fantastic conceptions of Joe Slater. The man himself was pitiably inferior in mentality and language alike, but his glowing titanic visions, though described in a barbarous and disjointed jargon, were assuredly things which only a superior or even exceptional brain could conceive. How, I often asked myself, could the stolid imagination of a Catskill degenerate conjure up sights whose very possession argued a lurking spark of genius? How could any backwoods dullard have gained so much as an idea of those glittering realms of supernal radiance in space about which Slater ranted in his furious delirium? More and more I inclined to the belief that in the pitiful personality who cringed before me lay the disordered nucleus of something beyond my comprehension, something infinitely beyond the comprehension of my more experienced but less imaginative medical and scientific colleagues. And yet I could extract nothing definite from the man. The sum of all my investigation was that, in a kind of semi-corporeal dream life, Slater wandered or floated through resplendent and prodigious valleys, meadows, gardens, cities, and palaces of light, in a region unbounded and unknown to man, that there he was no peasant or degenerate, but creature of importance and vivid life, moving proudly and dominantly, and checked only by a certain deadly enemy, who seemed to be a being of visible yet ethereal structure, and who did not appear to be of human shape, since Slater never referred to it as a man, or as aught save a thing. This thing had done Slater some hideous but unnamed wrong, which the maniac, if maniac he were, yearned to avenge. From the manner in which Slater alluded to their dealings, I judged that he and the luminous thing had met on equal terms, that in his dream existence the man was himself a luminous thing of the same race as his enemy. This impression was sustained by his frequent references to flying through space and burning all that impeded his progress. Yet these conceptions were formulated in rustic words wholly inadequate to convey them, a circumstance which drove me to the conclusion that if a true dream world indeed existed, oral language was not its medium for the transmission of thought. Could it be that the dream soul inhabiting this inferior body was desperately struggling to speak things which the simple and halting tongue of dullness could not utter? Could it be that I was face to face with intellectual emanations which would explain the mystery if I could but learn to discover and read them? I did not tell the older physicians of these things, for middle age is skeptical, cynical, and disinclined to accept new ideas. Besides, the head of the institution had but lately warned me in his paternal way that I was overworking, that my mind needed a rest. It had long been my belief that human thought consists basically of atomic or molecular motion, convertible into ether waves of radiant energy, like heat, light, and electricity. This belief had early led me to contemplate the possibility of telepathy, or mental communication, by means of suitable apparatus, and I had in my college days prepared a set of transmitting and receiving instruments, somewhat similar to the cumbrous devices employed in wireless telegraphy as that crude pre-radio period. These I had tested with a fellow student, but achieved no result, had soon packed them away with other scientific odds and ends for possible future use. Now, in my intense desire to probe into the dream life of Joe Slater, I sought these instruments again, and spent several days in repairing them for action. When they were complete once more, I missed no opportunity for their trial. At each outburst of Slater's violence, I would fit the transmitter to his forehead and the receiver to my own, constantly making delicate adjustments for various hypothetical wavelengths of intellectual energy. I had but little notion of how the thought impressions would, if successfully conveyed, arouse an intelligent response in my brain, but I felt certain that I could detect and interpret them. Accordingly, I continued my experiments, though informing no one of their nature. It was on the 21st of February, 1901, that the thing occurred. As I look back across the years, I realize how unreal it seems, and sometimes half wonder if old Dr. Fenton was not right when he charged it all to my excited imagination. I recalled that he listened with great kindness and patience when I told him, but afterward gave me a nerve powder and arranged for the half-year's vacation on which I departed the next week. That fateful night I was wildly agitated and perturbed, for despite the excellent care he had received, Joe Slater was unmistakably dying. Perhaps it was his mountain freedom that he missed, or perhaps the turmoil in his brain had grown too acute for his rather sluggish physique. But at all events, the flame of vitality flickered low in the decadent body. He was drowsy near the end, and as darkness fell, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. I did not strap on the straitjacket, as was customary when he slept, since I saw that he was too feeble to be dangerous, even if he woke in mental disorder once more before passing away. But I did place upon his head and mind the two ends of my cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. In the cell with us was one nurse, a mediocre fellow who did not understand the purpose of the apparatus or think to inquire into my course. As the hours wore on, I saw his head droop awkwardly in sleep, but I did not disturb him. I myself, lulled by the rhythmical breathing of the healthy and dying man, must have nodded a little later. The sound of weird lyric melody was what aroused me. Chords, vibrations, and harmonic ecstasies echoed passionately on every hand, while on my ravished sight burst the stupendous spectacle of ultimate beauty. Walls, columns, and architraves of living fire blazed effulgently around the spot where I seemed to float in air, extending upward to an infinitely high vaulted dome of indescribable splendor. Blending with this display of palatial magnificence, or rather supplanting it at times in kaleidoscopic rotation, were glimpses of wide plains and graceful valleys, high mountains and inviting grottos, covered with every lovely attribute of scenery which my delighted eye could conceive of, yet formed wholly of some glowing ethereal plastic entity, which in consistency partook as much of spirit as of matter. As I gazed, I perceived that my own brain held the key to these enchanting metamorphoses. For each vista which appeared to me was the one my changing mind most wished to behold. Amidst this Elysian realm I dwelt not as a stranger, for each sight and sound was familiar to me, just as it had been for uncounted eons of eternity before, and would be for like eternities to come. Then the resplendent aura of my brother of light drew near and held colloquy with me, soul to soul, with silent and perfect interchange of thought. The hour was one of approaching triumph, for was not my fellow being escaping at last from a degrading periodic bondage, escaping forever, and preparing to follow the accursed oppressor even unto the uttermost fields of ether, that upon it might be wrought a flaming cosmic vengeance which would shake the spheres? We floated thus for a little time, when I perceived a slight blurring and fading of the objects around us, as though some force were recalling me to earth, where I least wished to go. The form near me seemed to feel a change also, for it gradually brought its discourse toward a conclusion, and itself prepared to quit the scene, fading from my sight at a rate somewhat less rapid than that of the other objects. A few more thoughts were exchanged, and I knew that the luminous one and I were being recalled to bondage, though for my brother of light it would be the last time. The sorry planet shell being well nigh spent, in less than an hour my fellow would be free to pursue the oppressor along the Milky Way, and past the hither stars to the very confines of infinity. A well-defined shock separates my final impression of the fading scene of light from my sudden and somewhat shamefaced awakening and straightening up in my chair as I saw the dying figure on the couch move hesitantly. Joe Slater was indeed awaking, though probably for the last time. As I looked more closely, I saw that in the sallow cheeks shone spots of color which had never before been present. The lips, too, seemed unusual, being tightly compressed as if by the force of a stronger character than had been Slater's. The whole face finally began to grow tense, and the head turned restlessly with closed eyes. I did not rouse the sleeping nurse, but readjusted the slightly disarranged headbands of my telepathic radio, intent to catch any parting message the dreamer might have to deliver. All at once the head turned sharply in my direction, and the eyes fell open, causing me to stare in blank amazement at what I beheld. The man who had been Joe Slater, the Catskill decadent, was now gazing at me with a pair of luminous, expanding eyes whose blue seemed subtly to have deepened. Neither mania nor degeneracy was visible in that gaze, and I felt beyond a doubt that I was viewing a face behind which lay an active mind of high order. At this juncture my brain became aware of a steady external influence operating upon it. I closed my eyes to concentrate my thoughts more profoundly, and was rewarded by the positive knowledge that my long-sought mental message had come at last. Each transmitted idea formed rapidly in my mind, and though no actual language was employed, my habitual association of conception and expression was so great that I seemed to be receiving the message in ordinary English.
"Joe Slater is dead,"
came the soul-petrifying voice or agency from beyond the wall of sleep. My opened eyes sought the couch of pain and curious horror, but the blue eyes were still calmly gazing, and the countenance was still intelligently animated.
"He is better dead, for he was unfit to bear the active intellect of cosmic entity. His gross body could not undergo the needed adjustments between ethereal life and planet life. He was too much of an animal, too little a man. Yet it is through his deficiency that you have come to discover me, for the cosmic and planet souls rightly should never meet. He has been my torment in diurnal prison for 42 of your terrestrial years. I am an entity like that which you yourself become in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light, and have floated with you in the effulgent valleys. It is not permitted me to tell your waking earth self of your real self, but we are all roamers of vast spaces and travelers in many ages. Next year I may be dwelling in the Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel empire of San Chan, which is to come 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to the worlds that reel about the red Arcturus, and dwelt in the bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the earth self know life and its extent! How little indeed ought it to know for its own tranquility! Of the oppressor I cannot speak. You on earth have unwittingly felt its distant presence. You who without knowing idly gave the blinking beacon the name of Algol, the demon star. It is to meet and conquer the oppressor that I have vainly striven for eons, held back by bodily encumbrances. Tonight I go as a nemesis bearing just and blazingly cataclysmic vengeance. Watch me in the sky close by the demon star. I cannot speak longer, for the body of Joe Slater grows cold and rigid, and the coarse brains are ceasing to vibrate as I wish. You have been my friend in the cosmos. You have been my only friend on this planet, the only soul to sense and seek for me within the repellent form which lies on this couch. We shall meet again, perhaps in the shining mists of Orion's sword, perhaps on a bleak plateau in prehistoric Asia, perhaps in unremembered dreams tonight, perhaps in some other form an eon hence, when the solar system shall have been swept away.
At this point, the thought waves abruptly ceased, and the pale eyes of the dreamer, or, can I say, dead man, commenced to glaze fishily. In a half-stupor, I crossed over to the couch and felt of his wrist, but found it cold, stiff, and pulseless. The sallow cheeks paled again, and the thick lips fell open, disclosing the repulsively rotted fangs of the degenerate Joe Slater. I shivered, pulled a blanket over the hideous face, and awakened the nurse. Then I left the cell and went silently to my room. I had an instant and unaccountable craving for a sleep whose dreams I should not remember. The climax? What plain tale of science can boast of such a rhetorical effect? I have merely set down certain things appealing to me as facts, allowing you to construe them as you will. As I have already admitted, my superior, old Dr. Fenton, denies the reality of everything I have related. He vows that I was broken down with nervous strain, and badly in need of the long vacation on full pay which he so generously gave me. He assures me on his professional honor that Joe Slater was but a low-grade paranoiac, whose fantastic notions must have come from the crude hereditary folk tales which circulate in even the most decadent of communities. All this he tells me, yet I cannot forget what I saw in the sky on the night after Slater died. Lest you think me a biased witness, another pen must address this final testimony, which may perhaps supply the climax you expect. I will quote the following account of the star Nova Persei verbatim from the pages of that eminent astronomical authority, Professor Garrett P. Service. On February 22nd, 1901, a marvelous new star was discovered by Dr. Anderson of Edinburgh, not very far from Ghoul. No star had been visible at that point before. Within 24 hours, the stranger had become so bright that it outshone Capella. In a week or two, it had visibly faded, and in the course of a few months, it was hardly discernible with the naked eye. End of section 29, and end of the weird fiction of Fantasy Fan magazine.